Story 1. My grandmother was always a strong woman who knew how to keep her cool. She had been through a lot, from a childhood spent in the depths of the Great Depression to the tough years when the family struggled financially. But what happened in October 2011 was too much for her. Her grandfather, with whom she had lived almost all her life, died of a heart attack. He was a man who had never been known to be weak, and his death was so sudden that even my grandmother could not prepare for it. He was gone, and she was left alone in their house, on a hillside overlooking San Francisco Bay. This place was their home, the house that she and my grandfather had put so much effort into making cozy and a real refuge. It was where they raised their children, and it was the same house my mother grew up in. When my grandfather passed away, my grandmother was left not only without a partner, but also without someone to support her in her old age. My grandmother often said that she was not afraid of loneliness, but I knew it was hard for her. She never complained. She didn't want anyone to see how hard it was for her, but I felt it. My grandfather's death not only took away her life partner, but also deprived her of a part of her usual life. My grandma's life was simple, but not boring. She was alone, but often received guests, neighbors, friends, all those who did not forget about her, despite her age. But no one could forget that she was a widow, and this time, it seemed, always reminded her how everything had changed. She sat alone more and more often, sometimes telling me how difficult it was for her to get used to his absence. I listened to her, and every word she said left a mark on my soul. One of the people who often came to Grandma's was a neighbor named Ed. He lived up the hill and had known my mother since she was a child. Ed was an ordinary neighbor, at least at first. I remember him always tinkering with his hot rod pickup. He owned his own business and seemed successful and fairly independent, a seemingly unsuspicious person who was always friendly. But that was before his behavior began to change. I didn't notice it right away. At first it was something subtle, an oddity in the way he looked at me, in the way he spoke. But as the months went by, it became more and more obvious that something was wrong. He started saying strange things, especially when talking to my mother or me. At one point he told me he saw God in the sky, just like that, in response to me looking at the moon. I couldn't understand what he was talking about, and it struck me as odd. I'd always liked looking at the moon, and I did it often, as did many other people. But for Ed, it was more than just an interest in astronomy. It became an idea that he was increasingly inhabiting. When we visited Grandma's house one day, his behavior became even more alarming. My mom and I pulled up to the house, and Ed was standing in his driveway, as usual. He was there with some kind of tool in his hands, and his eyes were wary, almost threatening. I couldn't figure out why he was acting this way, but I felt like something was wrong. He had always been strange, but now his actions were becoming downright unpredictable. Mom tried to remain calm, but I could see how worried she was. She didn't want to voice her concerns openly, but I could feel how tense she was. Every time we visited, I noticed that his presence became more and more heavy and ominous for us. Even his gait became different, sharper, more insistent. I didn't know what exactly had changed in Ed, but I knew one thing. His strange behavior was becoming more and more noticeable. I couldn't help but notice it, and I couldn't help but think about how it affected my grandmother. She, in turn, tried to be kind and not show that she was scared, but I saw how she was becoming more and more worried about him with each passing day. My dad, who rarely talked about such things, once noticed that his behavior had become completely unpredictable and strange. But what really bothered me was the way Ed was starting to affect those around him. He wasn't just acting weird, he was becoming aggressive. His behavior became so alarming that I began to wonder, what if at some point he went to extremes? And what would happen to Grandma if his aggression became unmanageable? It was the beginning of what would become a growing sense of danger every time we visited Grandma. And with each visit, I became increasingly worried about her safety. I felt anxiety creeping into my soul as I thought about how Ed might be more dangerous than he seemed. Grandma was alone, and I didn't know what else to do to protect her, but I knew that she was becoming more vulnerable every day, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. Over time, I began to realize that what had seemed like simple quirks in Ed's behavior were, in fact, just the tip of the iceberg. The quiet neighborhood that had always seemed so cozy and safe to me suddenly began to change threateningly. And this changed precisely when I began to notice more and more how his looks were becoming more and more distorted, how his words sounded more and more alarming. Everything that had seemed harmless before was now turning into a threat. My grandmother, although a woman of an older generation, was not naive. She had been through a lot, seen a lot. And even at 93, she would not have been so vulnerable if it had not been for what was happening to Ed. She began to feel that his behavior was becoming increasingly strange and even aggressive, but she tried not to show it. She did not want to upset us, her family, with her worries. But I knew she was worried more than she allowed herself to show. One day, when my mom and I pulled up to my grandmother's house, I noticed him right away. Ed was standing in his driveway holding a metal rod in his hands. It wasn't just any tool. It was a real heavy piece of metal. His face was tense, his eyes were strange. He looked as if his whole world revolved around what he was holding. I didn't know what to think. It was so weird. Ed was always so calm and confident, and now he was standing there like he was ready for something. He looked at us, and I felt a chill run down my spine. He was weird at that moment. His face was blank, like he didn't know what he was doing. He was holding this metal rod, but not a word came out of his mouth. He just stood there and stared, and we couldn't take our eyes off him. Mom immediately became nervous. She quickly opened the car door, and I saw her hand start shaking as she got out. "Are you okay?" my dad asked, sounding concerned, but so soft against the odd backdrop that it seemed almost out of place. Ed turned slowly toward him and smiled, mockingly answering, "Are you okay?" His eyes were angry, and his smile was nothing like his usual friendly grin. We quickly walked into Grandma's house, leaving Ed behind. Mom was scared, and it showed, but none of us said anything about it out loud. We all knew the situation was strange, but no one wanted to openly discuss what might be going on. We just tried to forget about it, hoping that it was a random occurrence with no deeper reasons. But here was the worst part. The next few days were a real test for all of us. Ed's behavior became increasingly erratic. He began showing up at the property more often, and each time he did something strange, he seemed to be deliberately provoking Grandma and us, as if he had some goal in mind, to cause some kind of disturbance. I noticed that he would often stand outside and just stare at Grandma's house, motionless. It was strange, and his gaze became increasingly wary, almost hypnotic. He was not looking at the house itself, but at us, as if he knew we were noticing him and enjoyed it. Grandma was very reserved and tried not to show how much it bothered her, but it was clear to me that she was starting to feel threatened. I noticed how she tried to avoid direct contact with Ed when he came over, and that was another signal. She had always been so brave, but now even she was starting to doubt his intentions. One day I went outside to take a walk in the neighborhood. It was already dark, but I couldn't forget what had happened to Ed. I was walking down the road when I suddenly noticed him again. He was standing in the shadows, as if he was hiding. He didn't move, didn't stir, but I felt like his gaze was directed in my direction. I didn't want him to notice me, so I hurried back into the house. But even when I returned, this feeling of anxiety did not leave me. I didn't know what was happening to Ed, but one thing was clear: he was becoming more and more dangerous. I tried to talk to my mom about what was bothering me about Ed's behavior, but she just brushed it off. She said it was just getting older, that Ed was going through some personal issues, but I felt that wasn't true. I began to fear that his behavior was actually becoming a threat to our safety, and that if nothing was done, it could all get out of control. When I saw him again, standing with some tool on his property, I realized that his odd behavior, which seemed harmless, was actually building up. Something was going to happen. I just didn't know when or what. It had been a few weeks since I had last seen Ed with that metal rod. His behavior was becoming increasingly erratic, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen at any moment. Anything that had seemed odd now seemed like a harbinger of something dangerous. This wasn't just old age or some temporary annoyance. Ed was becoming more and more sinister, and I knew my grandmother could feel it, too. One day, when I went to visit my grandmother again, my mother was with us, as usual. This time, the car was especially quiet. I could tell that she was worried, that her anxiety was not going unnoticed. It was as if everything around was covered with some invisible tension. I couldn't help but notice how slightly nervous my mother was as we approached the house. I could see her eyes, how she assessed the surroundings, as if trying to understand what was happening to this place that had once been her home. When we pulled up to Grandma's house, Ed was nowhere to be seen. I felt a strange mixture of relief and wariness, but as it turned out, we couldn't relax. The next day, while we were walking, I spotted him. He was outside again. This time, his behavior was even more suspicious. He was standing next to his house, and his gaze was directed in our direction. I quickly turned away from his eyes, but from the corner of my eye, I still noticed how he slowly and tensely watched our every step. It was like a game of cat and mouse. Ed was watching, and it made me feel like he knew more about us than we knew about him. It was like he was enjoying making us feel uncomfortable. There was no friendliness in his gaze, only a cold threat. That night, it got even worse. My mom, Grandma and I were sitting in the house when suddenly there was loud screaming. I remember my mom jumping up, her face pale. We all ran outside, but as soon as I stepped through the door, I realized it was Ed again. His screams were so loud that they sounded like not just angry indignation, but also a frantic roar. He was screaming something that made no sense, to which there was no rational response. I felt the coldness grip my body. This wasn't just some random outburst of emotion. I knew he was on the edge, and that every step he took could lead to something unpredictable. Soon, Rob, a neighbor across the street who my mom had known since she was a child, came running up to us. He was worried. His face was tense, and he said that he had heard all the screaming and had come to see what was going on. We were all standing there trying to figure out what to do when suddenly Ed's screams turned into something absolutely terrifying. They were screams of rage, but there was a crazy aggression in them, like he was no longer in control of himself. We returned to the house. Mom tried to calm Grandma down, but I could see her face becoming more and more worried. I couldn't calm down myself. I realized that Ed was becoming more and more of a threat, and that with every action he took, the chances of him staying within the confines of his yard were getting smaller. As time went on, Ed's behavior became increasingly erratic. He no longer just stood there holding a tool. He became more active in his aggressive behavior. One night, he ran out into the street with a baseball bat and began smashing Rob's streetlights. It was completely pointless, but there was something wildly menacing about his actions. I couldn't figure out what was driving him. What made a grown man who once seemed like an ordinary neighbor become such a beast? Why was he destroying what was the point of all this? Maybe it was an attempt to draw some kind of reaction out of us. Maybe he wanted to make us feel like he had power over us. But whatever it was, I could see that his behavior was beyond all reasonable limits. Rob couldn't let this go. He went to court and got a restraining order to keep Ed away from his house. It was one of the few times someone had the courage to put him in his place. And while it was a victory, I knew it didn't solve the problem. Ed was still destroying everything around him, and no one knew how far he was willing to go. But the most alarming events were yet to come. When Ed started to affect Grandma, I felt that it was more than just worry. He was deliberately disrupting her peace. One day, I noticed him walking through her property, yelling angrily at the people who were working on her landscaping. He didn't want anyone near her house, and he was just driving Grandma over the edge with this behavior. I saw her face change, how she became worried about all this. Even her habit of smiling and pretending that everything was fine couldn't hide her growing anxiety. And that's when I realized I couldn't ignore it anymore. I started thinking that, with every action he took, there was more and more of a threat, and that if we didn't do something, he might hurt someone. And what if it was Grandma? With each passing day, the tension between Ed and me grew. I noticed how my grandmother watched everything around her with caution, how her gaze often slid to the window, as if she were waiting for something. Sometimes, when I went into her house, I noticed how she was hiding her worries, trying to pretend that everything was fine, but I knew that it was not. Ed had become a threat that she felt with all her soul, although she did not express it in words. At her age, she could not hide her emotions, and I saw how every action of his, whether it was an accidental appearance at her fence or strange behavior on the street, left a deep trace of anxiety in her heart. Instead of feeling safe in her home, she was now paying more and more attention to the slightest sounds outside the window. All this time, I tried to convince myself that this was just old age anxiety. But the more I watched, the clearer it became that it wasn't just age. Ed was becoming more aggressive and unpredictable. He wasn't just yanking trash cans anymore, or just running out into the street with tools. It was something more, a real threat. Every step he took now felt like a harbinger of something terrible. One morning when I visited my grandmother again, she was especially worried. She sat in her favorite chair in the corner, trying not to show her worry, but I saw her hands shaking as she held the book. Everything was quiet around her, but I knew that the silence was deceptive. As always, my grandmother tried to hide her fear, pretending that everything was fine, but even her attempts to smile could not hide the anxiety that was becoming more obvious with each passing day. I could feel the threat creeping into the house. We could no longer be sure that Ed was just a man with erratic behavior. He was crossing a line, and we knew that with every move he made, the situation was becoming more dangerous. He could hide behind a mask of normality, but every action he took showed that he was no longer in control of himself. I knew we couldn't wait any longer. If we remained silent, the consequences could be catastrophic. When I first approached Ed, I still hoped that I could explain something to him, that he would realize that his behavior was already out of line. I remember approaching his house. It was the same as always, dark and neglected, like his inner world. His yard was empty, and for a moment it seemed even quieter than usual. I knocked on his door, but no one answered. There was no sound, no reaction, only silence, which immediately filled me with anxiety. I walked around the house and looked in the window. Ed was sitting in his yard, but his face was completely still. He was like a statue staring at the ground, as if something important was hidden from all of us. His eyes were not human. They were empty, unable to perceive reality. I stood there for a long time, watching him, feeling anxiety growing inside me. When I approached him, he didn't react right away, as if he didn't notice me. But there was no anger or aggression in his gaze, only some kind of hopeless melancholy. He was part of this unknown darkness that he himself had created. I realized that his behavior was the result of something much deeper and more terrible. He was no longer just a strange neighbor. He had become something dark, inexplicable, inexpressible. Then I went home and started thinking about what had happened. Everything I had experienced during those days wouldn't leave me. I didn't know what to do. We couldn't just ignore it anymore. Ed had become a threat that simply couldn't be ignored. And now I knew that my grandmother also felt that he wasn't just a strange neighbor. He had become a real threat that we couldn't put up with anymore. Every behavior he did now seemed like a harbinger of something terrible to come. My thoughts that he could become a danger to my grandmother became reality. All this time I had hoped that the situation would change, that he would go away, but now I realized that this would not happen. Ed was not just a warrior. He had become a real source of fear. As time went on, the threat posed by Ed continued to grow. I could no longer ignore the terror that was beginning to permeate my life. Every time he visited my grandmother, every time he moved around the neighborhood, I no longer saw him as an old man doing something odd, but as a step toward destruction. His behavior became more and more unpredictable and dangerous. My grandmother could no longer hide her fear, though she tried to keep it together. But I knew she felt what I felt. I could feel her tension in the air, her anxiety hidden behind her usual friendly exterior. I continued to observe his behavior, and each time it became clearer that he was not just out of his mind, he was on the edge. Ed was losing control. His strange behavior was becoming more and more aggressive. He was no longer limited to littering or disturbing the peace of his neighbors. He was becoming threatening. Every step he took, every word he said, sounded like a warning that at some point his madness would spill out and the consequences would be catastrophic. My concern for my grandmother grew with each passing day. She could no longer ignore what was happening around her. Even her habit of calling everything strange began to seem ridiculous, and I saw her gaze becoming more and more wary. One day, returning from the store, I saw Ed on the street. He was standing in the middle of the road, holding some kind of metal object in his hands. His face was distorted with anger, and his eyes were almost wild. I stopped, not knowing what to do. There was no remorse or pity in his behavior. He was like an animal driven into a corner, ready to do anything. But it didn't happen. At that moment, I decided that I wasn't going to wait for the situation to get out of control. I called my mom, warning her that I needed to keep Grandma away from Ed. It wasn't easy, but I knew that, at some point, we would have to take action. I couldn't sit back and watch his madness continue to ruin not only his life, but the lives of those around him. That evening, when I was at Grandma's, Mom and I began to discuss the situation. Grandma sat in her chair, her hands shaking, her eyes avoiding my gaze. She wasn't saying anything new, but I knew she was afraid. She couldn't imagine Ed doing anything harmful, but I was sure his behavior had gone far beyond just weird. He was dangerous. I couldn't hope that he would ever return to normal on his own. Ed had become something terrible that couldn't be ignored. That night I couldn't sleep. My thoughts revolved around Ed, his eyes, his words. I knew this couldn't go on much longer. I couldn't let him ruin my grandmother's life, my life, and the lives of everyone around him. He was a threat that couldn't be ignored. The next day, when I arrived at my grandmother's, it seemed as if the tension in the air had grown even thicker. My grandmother was sitting by the window again, as always, but today her gaze was directed not at the world around her, but inward, into the shadow she saw in her house. She didn't notice me until I approached her and told her that we had to act. In her eyes I saw understanding, but also fear. She knew it was time to do something, but she didn't know what. We began to discuss possible measures that might help. The realization that Ed could become truly dangerous hit me like a bolt from the blue. He was no longer just a strange neighbor. He had become a threat that needed to be stopped. But how? How could you stop a man who had completely lost touch with reality? I didn't know. But I did know one thing. If we didn't act now, the situation could become even more dangerous. Every day, Ed became more and more unpredictable. We all began to feel like the line between normality and madness was disappearing. All that was left was a choice. Either we take action now, or we wait until it was too late. I wasn't prepared to wait. There came a point when I couldn't wait any longer. I felt like everything that was happening around us was coming to a head. Ed wasn't just a strange neighbor anymore. He had become a real threat. Every appearance, every strange behavior or threat felt like a step towards something destructive. All this time I had been trying to remain calm and hope that the situation would somehow resolve itself, but now I knew that it wouldn't. My grandmother was no longer the same. Even her habit of remaining optimistic and hiding her worries could no longer contain her anxiety. She was worried, and her worries became my own. I knew that we could no longer stand aside, ignoring his oddities, which were now becoming more and more dangerous. The solution came when I learned that he was back outside, holding something metal in his hands. He was standing outside his house, again with that strange expression on his face, and it looked like he was ready for action. I could no longer watch this in silence. I called my mother and told her that we had to do something. We couldn't ignore this threat any longer. We decided that I had to go and talk to him. It wasn't easy, knowing that this man had become dangerous and unstable, and realizing that we were one step away from a real tragedy. It was driving me crazy, but there was no other choice. I knew I had to take control of the situation. My heart was pounding as I approached Ed's house. There was tension in the air, and I felt the moment approaching. I was alone, and the only thing I could do was make Ed realize that his actions could not continue. I went to his door and knocked, but there was only silence in response. Everything was silent and ominous, as if nature itself was waiting for something significant to happen. I ventured to his window. His house was dark, and I could not see his face, but I knew he was inside. After a few minutes of silence, I knocked again. This time I heard footsteps. He opened the door, but his gaze was empty and even a little hostile. He stood at the threshold as if he did not care who was in front of him. There was no joy or fear in his eyes, only coldness and alienation. We stood in silence, watching each other. I tried to talk to him, but my words were drowned in his incomprehension. He did not listen. He was busy with his thoughts, his worries, his visions. Everything he did seemed meaningless and hopeless. I didn't know what to say. His silence grew more unsettling with each passing second. I could feel the pressure building, this moment inevitably leading to some kind of resolution. I didn't know what he needed, what he really wanted, but I knew one thing. If we didn't intervene, if we didn't stop him, he could do harm. My grandmother was in danger, and I couldn't risk her safety any longer. There was no remorse in his eyes, no hope. He was far from the man everyone had once known. That night, I didn't sleep. My mother and I discussed what we needed to do. The realization that we were dealing with a man who was no longer in control of his actions weighed heavily on me. We knew that situations like this rarely ended peacefully. Ed could be dangerous, and I didn't know what would happen if his madness continued to escalate. I felt that the moment had come for decisive action, but how could we act if all our efforts could only make the situation worse? The next day, we decided to talk to the local authorities. We went to the police, explaining the situation. Although they couldn't intervene right away, they made it clear that if we felt the situation was getting out of control, we should report it immediately. I knew I couldn't leave things to chance any longer. We became more wary, more determined. This was the last chance to prevent possible violence. We were ready to act if Ed took another step towards destruction. Over the next few weeks, the tension continued. The situation grew more dangerous with each passing day, but I knew we couldn't just sit back and watch. We had to act before it was too late. Ed was no longer just an eccentric neighbor. He had become a real threat, and we couldn't ignore him any longer. This wasn't a war with physical force, but with what lurked in his mind, in his eyes, in his actions. And I wasn't ready to give up. Story 2. The beautiful state of Michigan has always been a mystery to me. I was born and raised in this corner of the world, where the weather can be as changeable as the people themselves. On the one hand, it could be predictable, but on the other, every storm, every strong gust of wind concealed some hidden threat. Life in this place has always been associated with the constant expectation of something unexpected, like a sudden and unpredictable storm that comes from across the lake and changes the whole picture of the day. This has always given a special atmosphere to my home. My house was on the outskirts of a small town, just outside of it. It was a secluded place where it seemed you could shut out the world, forget about the outside bustle, and just live in your own rhythm. We all lived in the house, me, my younger brother Jack, my older sister Megan, my parents, and my grandfather, who, despite his age, was with us not out of necessity, but by choice. He was always here, although we all knew that he did not like to be under someone's supervision. He drank a lot, and this had long been an integral part of his life. Sometimes his behavior, strange and difficult for us to accept, created the very atmosphere in which you would like to hide and fade into the shadows. But we were a family, and no matter how difficult it was, we lived together. It all started out as usual. The little worries of the day seemed insignificant in the moment, but they were the ones that would eventually go wrong. I was sitting in the front yard, fixing my bike, feeling the day slip into the evening with every turn of the tool. Jack, as always, was full of energy and adventure, riding his mini SUV without thinking about the consequences. I warned him more than once to be careful, but all I heard in response was a laughing. "This is going to be awesome." He was so eager for action, not seeing the real dangers around him. When it was time for dinner, we all gathered around the table. The house was silent, broken only by the loud flow of beer that Grandpa produced as he sipped his drink. He was loud, his snores and silent grins accompanying each sip. Mom and Dad tried to be polite, but the tension ran through our entire relationship. I felt like we were all there, but no one was really there. This feeling was reinforced when Grandpa announced that a storm was coming. I immediately felt the temperature in the room change, as if his words were no longer just a warning. The room was growing darker, and I glanced at the sliding door, through which I could just see the sky darkening, as if someone had drawn a huge black curtain. The weather was always strange in our area, but this storm felt different. My father watched it silently, clearly worried, and it was clear from his face that the predicted worsening of the situation did not bode well. Not even an hour had passed before the house began to shake from the first gusts of wind. I followed my father when he decided to go out into the yard and check on the trampoline, which, as it turned out, might have been blown away by the storm. Every step in the yard felt heavy, and the wind was so strong that I almost lost my balance as soon as I stepped out the back door. The impact with this element was so powerful that I felt myself literally being pulled to the side, almost being carried away with me. Once outside, I noticed how everything around me was in the grip of a storm. The rain was pouring down on my face, and the wind was whipping me around, trying to push me away, but I could feel its power. It was as if nature was trying to put everything back in its place, as if we were all wrong to think we could control this environment. I continued to follow my father, feeling it was getting harder to go against the elements, but we achieved our goal, tied up the trampoline, and without saying a word, we headed back to the house. Going back inside didn't bring a sense of safety. The house was dark, with only the dim light from the old lamps giving a sense of life. When I returned to the kitchen, Grandpa was holding an ice cream cone with a grin and was ready to offer some sarcastic comment. He always liked to tell stories about how he had faced storms in his youth, even those that seemed unbearable to ordinary people. But it wasn't just a storm, it was something more. As I sat in the living room, listening to my grandfather reminisce, a sharp knock on the door interrupted all other sounds. I froze and everyone fell silent. At that moment, I realized that the silence wasn't just atmospheric, it was an expectation of something. Something we couldn't predict, but that we knew was coming. I couldn't shake the feeling that what awaited us was not just a storm, but something unknown. My father opened the door. The moment I saw a woman in a yellow raincoat, with bright gray eyes and an enigmatic smile, enter our house. I felt the tension in the air. She said that her car had broken down and that she had been forced to seek refuge here. My mother had immediately offered her shelter, but I felt that something was wrong. This woman, who seemed so calm and confident, had disrupted the usual rhythm of our day, as if this storm was not random, and she herself was part of something stranger than we could imagine. As she entered the house and I continued to watch her, the thought flashed through my mind that not everything that happens has an explanation. Sometimes things that look like a coincidence can actually be part of a more complex game that we all play without understanding the rules. When I returned to the house, the feeling of strangeness only intensified. The woman in the yellow cloak sat at the table, accepting the offered tea as if it were the most ordinary thing. But there was some hidden meaning in her eyes, elusive but noticeable. I could not understand why she immediately seemed so familiar to me, although I was sure that I had never met her before. It was as if she was part of this storm, part of nature itself, as if she had come here not by chance, but at the call of something much more powerful. The creak of the old porch door caught my attention, but I decided not to interfere. My father was standing in the hallway, talking to her, his face intent, as if he were trying to figure out who she really was. I knew he was a man who always favored common sense, and this encounter with a stranger was clearly perplexing him. His intuition told him that something was wrong with her story, but he too couldn't figure out what it was. My father had never believed in the supernatural, but even he couldn't help but notice that this storm and this woman were coming just a little too well timed. When I returned to the living room, Jack and Megan were discussing the news that there had been rumors going around town about strange child disappearances. The weather, of course, was always the main topic of conversation in Michigan, but right now the rumors seemed out of place given what was going on at home. And Megan was skeptical as usual, claiming that it was just another rumor around town, but I noticed her eyes narrow slightly as she heard about the latest goings-on. The silence in this house was unnatural. The woman with the yellow coat sat by the window, watching the goings-on outside the house, but she didn't seem to be paying attention to us. My sister Megan and Jack tried to continue their conversation, but I was drawn to that window. I couldn't tell what she was seeing, but her calm and lack of fear seemed out of place against the raging elements outside. I would have had trouble sitting still if I had felt like she did. Then I decided to go out and check what was going on outside. The wind had died down, and even the rain seemed to have eased. I opened the door and stepped into the dark evening. As always at such moments, the air was crisp and cold, but something about it was different. It wasn't just damp, it was filled with something different. Some strange tension that I couldn't explain in words. Suddenly I noticed that the light in the house was dim, as if we were not sitting under a roof, but in some underground chamber, where the light came from a distance and could not illuminate the space as it should have. The noise of the wind suddenly changed to some strange, barely audible sound, as if someone was nearby, but could not say where exactly. I froze, listening. The weather seemed to have calmed down, but in fact it only hid something that was growing underneath. I could not say exactly what, but the feeling of uneasiness grew stronger. My thoughts were interrupted by the voice of a woman who came up behind me. I didn't hear her footsteps as she quietly approached and spoke. She said that the storm had not yet passed, that this was only the beginning, and that what would happen tomorrow would be even more destructive. Of course, I did not believe her words. It was just a game of chance. It all somehow came down to a strange coincidence. But her words touched me, caused an unknown fear that I could not explain. I turned to answer her, but as soon as I met her gaze, everything inside me froze. She didn't look like someone who just happened to be there. There was something else in her eyes, something old, something that couldn't be explained as just observing the weather. She was here for a purpose, and that purpose was connected to us. I felt that strange tension in the air again. The look in her eyes was so sure that I felt that same strange sensation again, as if I were part of something bigger, something I couldn't quite understand. All these moments, the rain, the storm, the woman, her calm were beginning to come together in one endless series of events that seemed to me to be a harbinger of something serious. I felt a pit of uneasiness in my stomach, but instead of going back into the house and pushing the thoughts away, I decided to go further and see what was going on outside. I moved towards the forest, unable to resist the temptation to find out what was lurking in its dark corners. The feeling that I was part of something that was predicting me was growing stronger. The silence of the forest was eerie. I couldn't figure out what it was that scared me so much, but every step I took on the damp ground felt wrong. The wind was still blowing, but its gusts were not as strong now, and the rain had turned into a fine drizzle, which only added to the heaviness of my thoughts. I kept walking, trying to push away the anxiety, but it followed me like a shadow, squeezing my chest with every step. Every now and then I would hear the creak of branches or the rustling of feet, but none of these sounds seemed natural. It was as if the forest wasn't just a forest. It was alive, and there was more to it than just trees and bushes and animals. I couldn't shake the feeling that there might be something unfamiliar lurking around every corner, something that shouldn't be there. I stopped and looked into the darkness between the trees. For a moment I thought I saw a shape, something large moving among the trunks. But when I tried to focus my gaze, it was gone. Overwork? I thought, no need to worry. It's just my nerves. However, the longer I stayed there, the clearer it became that something was wrong. The forest no longer seemed simply dark and gloomy, but as if everything around was veiled by some dark energy. There was a heaviness in the air, as if the forest itself was going through something that could not be explained with simple words. I felt like something invisible was watching me, and it was becoming more and more difficult to breathe with each passing minute. I tried to calm down, but this oppressive, invisible gaze was unbearable. Even if nothing was happening, this forest was not a place where I could feel safe. I started to turn back, but with each step I found it more and more difficult to get my bearings. Everything around me seemed the same, and the forest that I knew like the back of my hand suddenly became unfamiliar and frightening. It seemed that the trees had suddenly become much denser, and the paths had disappeared, as if they had never existed. I began to panic when I realized I was lost. My pulse quickened and my breathing became rapid. I cursed myself for going out into the forest at such a late hour, in such weather. I just need to go back, I thought. Just follow the path back and find my way back to the usual path. But the forest seemed to be playing with my thoughts, entangling me deeper and deeper in its web. Suddenly, I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, a bark. It was distant, but despite that, I recognized it immediately. It was Harley. I could have sworn it was his dog, but the sound was strange, as if it were a little different, a little distorted. The bark I heard seemed different than usual, and there was something in its intonation that didn't match what I knew. It wasn't the cheerful bark that always accompanied us on walks. It was desperate, plaintive, as if the dog was in danger. I froze, listening. The barking continued, but it was becoming increasingly difficult to pinpoint where it was coming from. It could have been anything. Sounds from the forest, an illusion, my own fears, but I couldn't leave Harley there, in this empty, dark forest, so despite my doubts, I continued toward the sound. A feeling began to form inside me that I needed to be near him. Something told me that this connection was not accidental. I walked further and further, and with each step the forest became stranger. It seemed that the trees were moving, changing places, and the grass under my feet was not what it had been before. Everything around me began to resemble an illusion, and my steps became slower and slower. I felt my hands begin to shake, and my heart beat faster, but I could not stop. Finally, I reached the place where the barking seemed to be the loudest. However, I did not see the dog. Instead, there was something else standing in the center of the clearing. It was not the creature I knew, not Harley. It was a figure, almost invisible in the darkness, resembling the silhouette of a dog. But at some point, it became clear to me that it was not just an animal. There was a strange fire in the creature's eyes, yellow, like the light of a lantern in the night, and it looked at me with such a look that I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Something inexpressible squeezed in my chest when I realized that I was standing not in front of Harley, but in front of something else, and this something seemed to know me, knew everything about me. At first I thought it was just my imagination, something ordinary that simply didn't make sense. But that thought quickly disappeared when I felt the ground beneath my feet begin to vibrate. The forest around me was becoming denser and denser, and the air was filled with something indescribable, as if the forest itself were a living creature, trying to hide something from me. My breath hitched, and I stood there, unable to take my eyes off the silhouette that continued to stare at me with its bright yellow eyes. I tried to take a step back, but my feet were welded to the ground. That gaze wouldn't leave me. It seemed to penetrate into the very depths of my consciousness. I tried to breathe evenly, tried to understand what was happening, but my mind refused to accept the explanation. This was not a normal situation. The existence of that figure seemed impossible. My inner voice, which had previously told me that I should just leave and not interfere, was now screaming at me to run, to escape, but I couldn't. This thing wouldn't let me move. I stood rooted to the spot, staring into the eyes of what had once been a dog. But now it was something more. This figure had no fur, no clear outlines. It seemed to dissolve into the night, its outlines blurred like fog. I knew something was wrong. This wasn't an animal. This was something far older, something unimaginable. The barking I heard wasn't real. It wasn't a dog. It was something pretending to be one, something using that guise to make me come here to it. My heart was pounding in my chest and my breathing was getting faster. I was starting to panic, but something about the creature held me back. It didn't move, didn't make any attempt to attack. Instead, it just stood there and watched me lose control. I felt the ground beneath me begin to hum, and suddenly the entire forest seemed to come alive. The trees rustled, and the branches began to move in the rhythm of something unearthly. All the sounds around merged into one mass, and I found myself in the epicenter of this chaos. But the figure in front of me remained motionless, untouched by this storm. I didn't know what to do. My mind was screaming at me to go back, but I knew it would be impossible. I didn't know which way to go, and every attempt to move only made me feel more helpless. And then, as if by magic, the forest suddenly became quiet again. The sound of the wind ceased. The leaves stopped rustling, and I was left alone with this creature. It finally moved, but instead of coming closer, it moved away, dissolving into the darkness. Its eyes still sparkled in the darkness, and I knew that it was still watching me. My body regained its mobility, and I finally took a step back. There was no fear or determination in my heart. It was simply a desire to leave, to return, to get out of this nightmare. Every step towards the exit was filled with doubt, but I knew that I could not stay here any longer. As I turned to leave, The forest became dark and frightening again, but now everything was different. I knew that this forest, this silence, all this was not a coincidence. I felt that behind every step I took, there was something watching me. But I didn't dare look back. All I could do was keep walking, not stopping, not paying attention to what was happening around me. I didn't know how long I'd been moving, but when I finally saw the first glimmer of light through the trees, I knew I was out. The forest was behind me, and in front of me was the road that led home. But that feeling that I was still unsafe, that I was still haunted by what I'd seen in the forest, it wouldn't go away. I knew that going back would be a mistake, but I also knew that I would never be able to forget what had happened. When I finally got home, I knew the experience had changed me. Creatures like the one I'd seen in the woods shouldn't exist, and I still couldn't believe I'd lived through it. Several days had passed since I had emerged from the forest, but not a single day had passed without me thinking about what I had seen. I tried to concentrate on my usual activities, but all that came to my mind was that creature with bright eyes. Every evening when I closed my eyes, its gaze haunted me. It was as if it would not let me go, would not let me forget. I tried to talk to Harley, my dog, about it. Maybe she would somehow sense what was happening, but she remained as calm and carefree as ever, not for a moment showing that anything was bothering her. There was something unsettling about it. The dog, who had always been wary of the slightest change in her environment, now showed no reaction. I often walked around the house, pausing at each window, trying to see something unusual that could explain these strange events to me, but nothing. Everything was as usual. However, I knew that this could not be just a coincidence. Something in this forest and in that creature was unnatural. A few weeks passed, and I felt more and more trapped. The forest still fascinated me, and even though I was unsure, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to go back. I tried telling friends and acquaintances what had happened, but every time their reaction was the same. They took it as a story, as something strange but not dangerous. But I knew it was more than that. I spent more and more time alone with Harley and myself. Dogs are known to sense threats where there are none, but despite all the anxiety, Harley continued to act calmly, as if everything was normal. However, the more I watched her, the more I began to notice oddities in her behavior. Sometimes she would sit, stare at one point in a dark corner of the house, and not respond when I called her name. Sometimes I felt as if she heard something but did not want to tell me about it. One night, I woke up from a strange noise and noticed Harley standing at the window, looking out into the dark yard. This was completely out of character for her. She usually never showed any interest in what was going on outside. I got out of bed and went to her, but she didn't move, didn't turn around. I reached out to pet her, and at that moment she suddenly turned around and looked into my eyes. She looked strange, her eyes were empty, as if there was no life in them. At that moment, I realized something was happening to my friend, my dog. She had become some other creature. I felt a chill run down my spine, and then, as if by magic, I heard that bark again. It was strange, muffled, not like the sounds Harley usually makes. It was something completely different. My hands began to shake. I knew this wasn't just a fluke. Whatever had been in those woods might have returned. But why was it here now? Why was it affecting my dog? Not knowing what to do, I opened the door and went out into the dark yard. Step by step, I moved towards the place where my house used to stand. There was silence around, but I felt that this was only a premonition of what was to come. I turned around, and at that moment in the darkness I saw her, the same figure that was in the forest. She stood on the border between light and shadow, her eyes once again blazing like fire. My legs refused to move. I was paralyzed with terror, and only then did I realize I was too close to being finally overtaken by this creature. My strength began to leave me, and I realized that if I didn't do something right now, it would be too late. All I could do was run. I turned and ran towards the house without looking back, feeling the cold sweat on my forehead. As I flew through the door and slammed it behind me, I knew I had escaped again, but I was no longer the same person. This wasn't just the forest, this wasn't just a scary visit in the night. I knew that the thing wouldn't leave me alone until I found out what it really wanted from me. And now, every night when I went to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. I was trapped, and this trap was not created by the forest, not by the animals, it was a part of me. Story 3. I don't know how or why I escaped, but now I'm here in this place and I need help. She's still here watching me. It's unbearable, right behind me like a shadow that never goes away. This place I've ended up in is unlike any other. It's not just a small town. Everything here seems frozen in time, and I can't shake the feeling that something terrible is lurking beneath the surface. We lived in this town. It was quiet, like everything else in it. Every morning would begin with me hearing the sounds of morning activity, the local merchants unpacking their goods in the market square, the children playing in the street, and the sun rising over the horizon, illuminating the old houses with their characteristic red roofs and thick stone walls. We lived in a small house on the corner, and I remember often walking around this town, enjoying the silence that reigned there. The streets were narrow, sometimes crossed by ancient bridges, and the air was always fresh, filled with the smell of freshly baked buns from the local bakery. But there was something wrong with this place. I felt it even then. The town was small, but each house had a story to tell, hidden within its walls like ancient secrets forgotten by time. One house in particular stood out. It stood a little way from the main square, and despite its age, it looked like something from another world entirely. It was a shop, like a small Victorian cottage. Its walls were covered in dull green and brown wallpaper, barely visible due to the time that had faded it. Two large windows flanked a shabby, dark door. All this created the feeling that this place had long been forgotten, but it was untouched by time. The first time I saw this shop, I felt that something was wrong. It stood out from all the other houses. The others were neatly restored, with well-kept facades, but this one stood like an abandoned old toy, whose owner had long since disappeared. As I passed by, my steps involuntarily slowed. I didn't know why, but I was curious. I've always been someone who liked to solve mysteries, and this house was no exception. I moved closer to peer through the windows. The fog glass prevented me from seeing anything clear, just vague silhouettes. These silhouettes seemed to be more and more like faces, a multitude of eyes all staring straight at me. They stared without moving. I felt a chill run down my spine. What I saw looked like antique porcelain dolls displayed on shelves, but these eyes were not like those of ordinary toys. These were eyes filled with something alive, something inhuman, as if the dolls, they were looking at me with condemnation, as if I had done something bad, something terrible. I stepped back, as if someone invisible had pushed me. But curiosity was stronger than fear, and I stepped toward the door again, although my heart was beating faster. I extended my hand and knocked, although I knew that no one would open. The door opened slowly, as if it understood my fear, and I stepped inside. The one who opened the door was an old man. His face was wrinkled, with deep folds, like an old map over which centuries had passed. He was dressed in a dark striped suit that looked old but in good condition, and his tall top hat said that he was definitely a man from another era. I didn't know what he was doing here, in this empty store, but here he was, and his gaze was attentive, sharp, like a predator's. I didn't know what to expect. There was a strange, subtle aura about the old man that I couldn't describe with words. He wasn't smiling, but there was something strange in his eyes. I stood there, not knowing what to say, until I noticed that the room was completely empty. Only a few old shelves lined the walls, displaying antiques, old dolls, porcelain, exquisite glass figurines, and, strangely, there wasn't a trace of dust. The table the old man was standing behind was as clean as a mirror. I don't know what made me take this step, but I asked him about the city. At that moment, the thought flashed through my head again, what's wrong here? I was not prepared for what he said, and although his words were simple, they sounded strange. I asked about the best places to see, and he told me about old churches and abandoned buildings. But when I asked about crime in this city, his answer made me freeze. Nothing bad ever happens in this city. His voice became a little quieter and his eyes changed. He added something like, "Don't listen to him. He's crazy." I couldn't understand what that meant. Everything about him was strange, and I felt an unknown fear growing inside me. I felt it was time to leave, and I thanked him. I took a deep breath as I stepped outside, but the strange feeling wouldn't leave me. It grew, like a dark shadow that followed my every step. I returned home, but even in my cozy home, I couldn't shake the thought of what I had just experienced. And that doll shop, I couldn't understand what it meant. Why did I feel like I was in a place that shouldn't exist? In the kitchen, I was busy preparing dinner, but the thought of the old man and his strange words wouldn't leave me. Everything was mixed up in my head, but I decided not to dwell on it. However, when I went up to the second floor to take off my shoes, I noticed something strange. My shoes, which I had left in place by the table, were turned the other way. This was not just a coincidence. I clearly remembered putting them on. But then, what was it? That evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Ghosts of thoughts haunted me, as if they were part of my own mind. The old man's strange behavior, his words, and now the unnaturally upside-down shoes, they all added up to something more than just a coincidence. I tried to convince myself that it was just my paranoia, that it could all be explained after all. But deep down, I knew something didn't add up. The shoes, like all the other little details, couldn't be a coincidence. I stood on the stairs for a long time looking at them and felt anxiety growing in my chest. It wasn't the usual anxiety. It was a feeling that I had violated an invisible boundary, that I had gone too far in exploring something I shouldn't have touched. I gathered my strength and approached the shoes. Carefully, as if they might hide something dangerous, I picked one up and put it back where it belonged. But when I stepped back to assess the result, the feeling that I had done something wrong did not leave me. No matter how hard I tried to calm myself down, the thoughts kept spinning in my head. I couldn't forget how the old man said that nothing bad is happening here. Those words, spoken with such a strange intonation, as if hiding some deep meaning, haunted me. Why did he say it that way? And who was the he the old man mentioned? I needed to know more, but I was afraid to go to that store again. Fear of the unknown was stronger than curiosity, but at the same time, it seemed like I couldn't stop. The next morning, I decided to return to the square. It was morning, and as always, the market was beginning its life with bright colors. The air was filled with the smell of freshly baked bread and roasted meat. I tried to drown out my anxiety by watching the people, their daily bustle. But despite the general feeling of calm, I felt like a stranger here. I approached the store, trying not to look in its direction, but my eyes involuntarily slid to its cracked door. It was slightly open, as if waiting for me. I stopped. At that moment, I heard the familiar creak of the old door, and before I could retreat, it swung open. I froze, and only a few seconds later realized that the same old man was standing on the threshold. His gaze was sharp as always, but this time there was something different in it. He looked worried, as if he knew that I would return, that I would not be able to leave everything as it was. I felt that strange chill running down my spine again. He didn't say a word, he just stood there watching me, as if he was trying to figure out what I was going to do. It felt like he was waiting for something, and I didn't know what. Involuntarily, I took a step forward. Step by step, I approached him, and although his gaze did not wander, I could not shake the feeling that behind his silence, there was something much more serious than just an old man with an antique shop. I did not know what exactly I wanted to find in this place, but the feeling that I needed to understand something was unbearable. As I stepped inside, the air immediately became thicker, as if the space around me had become smaller and I myself more vulnerable. The old man did not move, only looked at me, and I realized that he was not going to start a conversation. He was there, like some ancient guardian, keeping a secret locked away from prying eyes. I didn't know what to do, but I decided to go to the desk where the cash register was and start by asking him something simple. I asked him what there was to see in the city, and although his answer was short and general, there was a strange detachment to it, as if he wasn't talking about everything. Then I asked if there had been any crimes or strange events in the city. His answer was immediate and confident: nothing bad happens here. But something in his voice changed. He began to speak more softly, and his face became serious. "I don't listen to him, he's crazy," he added in a whisper, as if trying to warn me about something. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I wanted to leave, but something was holding me back. I couldn't understand why I couldn't just turn around and walk away. It felt like if I left, something would be left unfinished, something important that I needed to know. But I couldn't figure out what it was. I said goodbye to him, barely containing my fear, and left the store. When I was outside again, I felt my breathing become difficult. The air around me was damp, and it seemed to press down on me, somehow connecting me to this place, as if I were part of something large and hidden. I headed towards the house, but the same question was spinning in my head: what is going on here? Why do I feel so out of place? It wasn't just fear, but a feeling that I had become part of something I shouldn't have been touching. The next morning I woke up with a heavy feeling of anxiety that wouldn't leave me even in my sleep. I felt like this city, its walls and houses, like something invisible, pressing on me, like a shadow that follows my every move. All day, as if in slow motion, I tried to ignore the inner fear that seeped into my every action. But something had changed, and I felt uncomfortable in my own home. I decided to spend the day outside, away from the thoughts of the store and the strange old man who talked about things I couldn't understand. But the more I tried to push these thoughts away, the more they came back, as if pulling me back. I couldn't ignore this city, its atmosphere. No matter how hard I tried to hold on, in every street, every building, I saw traces of something that shouldn't be there. On my way to the market square, I noticed how strange the locals were acting. Their faces were calm at first glance, but if you looked closely, you could see this look, as if they all knew something that I did not. It was as if they were looking through me, not noticing, or perhaps not wanting to notice that I was there. Every glance I passed left an unpleasant feeling, as if they knew that I did not belong here. I walked across the square and headed towards the old houses that lined it. These buildings seemed almost alive, as if they hid a story that they never revealed to strangers. I decided to go back to the house where I lived, but the road to it was shrouded in a strange feeling that had not left me since I found myself in this place. Every step, every movement, everything I did seemed to violate the unknown harmony of this world. As I approached my house, I noticed that everything looked exactly the same as always. But at that moment, there was something wrong with the air, with the atmosphere itself. I walked inside, and the door closed behind me with a loud click. I tried to ignore the strange feeling, but it wouldn't go away. That evening, I thought again about the strange shop, the old man and his final warning. His words kept coming back to me. Don't listen to him, he's crazy. The moment he whispered them haunted me. Who was this he? Who was he talking about? And what did that phrase mean? Questions started swirling in my head like a funnel. I decided to go back there. I had to figure out what was going on. This town was hiding something, and I couldn't afford to leave without solving this mystery. There was no doubt I had to go back to the store, to this old man. Late in the evening, when the air was growing cold and the city was falling silent, I headed back toward the street where the store stood. My steps were heavy, as if the ground beneath my feet was pulling me down. The closer I got, the stronger this strange chill that was taking hold of me became. It wasn't physical, but rather mental, as if the very atmosphere of the city was trying to keep me from continuing to search. I approached the house and noticed that its windows were still closed, but the door, like last time, was slightly open. I could no longer stop myself. My fingers reached for the door handle, and without thinking, I stepped inside. The room greeted me with the familiar silence, but now it wasn't just empty, it seemed to have a life of its own. The air smelled of old wood and dust, and that same chandelier swinging in the center cast a dim light on the shelves of antiques. But something had changed. It was as if the light, the air, everything around me were looking at me. I couldn't believe my eyes, but I couldn't shake the feeling that these weren't just old things here. There was something alive, something watching. This time, the old man did not meet me at the door, and this made me strangely wary. I entered the room and looked around. He was sitting at the table, but now his gaze was sterner, as if he knew that I was back here again. He did not say a word, just remained silent, and this silence was heavy. I approached him, but fear seized me, as if I were trapped. There was a strange mixture of understanding and warning in his eyes, as if he was waiting for me to speak, but knew that I would not be able to answer the question that was tormenting me. I asked him again what was happening in this city, and his answer was not the same as the first time. He told me, "You should have figured it out yourself, but now that you've come here again, you can't leave." These words sounded like a sentence, like something final. I didn't know what it meant, but I was terrified. It was at that moment that I realized I was part of something bigger than I could have ever imagined. This town, this store, none of it was an accident. Something terrible was happening here, and I had just witnessed something that was hidden from everyone else. The next day, I woke up with a terrible feeling that everything that had happened yesterday was not just a figment of my imagination. The room was cold, and the rays of the morning sun barely penetrated through the curtains, creating a dim light that could not dispel the darkness in my soul. I sat on my bed and tried to figure out what to do now. The fear that had gripped me since the moment I found myself in that strange store again did not go away. It seemed that every corner of this city was hiding something that was waiting for its time to break out. That day, I didn't go to the square again. I stayed in my house, locked the doors and windows, as if they could protect me from what lurked beyond the boundaries of my perception. But I knew it wouldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that everything around me had slowed unnaturally, as if the world was still spinning. But with every step I took, I fell further behind it. My life was beginning to turn into a shaky illusion, and I didn't know where it would lead. I thought back to that moment in the store, when the old man said, "I can't leave." Those words haunted me. I tried to understand their meaning, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt it was becoming difficult to breathe. The city, that strange store, its empty streets, all of it seemed to be closing in on me, and I wasn't sure I could leave this place anymore. I needed to understand what was going on, and how it related to this strange old man in his shop. One thought kept spinning in my head. He knows something I need to understand. I was starting to think that his shop wasn't just a place to sell antiques. It was probably a trap, a time trap maybe, or something even worse. It was at that moment that I decided to go back to the store. I had to meet this man again, but now I couldn't just walk in like the first time. My confidence in my own perception was gone. This city didn't seem the same as before. It had become alien, as if it too knew that I didn't belong here. When I arrived at the shop, I noticed that its appearance had not changed. The same worn door, the same windows hiding a dark secret. I pulled the handle and stepped inside. This time was different. I felt that something was bound to happen. I was sure that I would not be able to leave, as he said. When I entered, there was no old man inside, just an empty room, except for a lot of old objects that filled the shelves. There was no chandelier, not the slightest movement. The shelf with the porcelain dolls was still there. Their eyes seemed to follow me, but now I did not see their malice, only concern. These dolls were dead, but there was a strange life in their eyes that nothing else had. I took a few steps forward and heard a soft, rustling sound, like someone was moving heavy things in the back of the store. I turned to see one of the shelves of antiques begin to slide open, revealing a narrow passage that had previously been hidden from view. My heart began to beat faster, and I stepped into the passage, despite all my instinctive warnings. The passage was dark, with barely visible outlines on the walls. I moved forward, feeling as if the walls were shrinking with each passing second. Something was pulling me further, and I could not move away. It was not fear, not curiosity. It was an unknown force that made me go, no matter what. It seemed that I walked for so long that I lost track of time. Everything around me was covered in a strange semi-darkness, as if light and shadow merged into one. And suddenly I realized I was in a different place. This was no ordinary store. This was something else, something ancient and forgotten. Time did not exist in this place, and perhaps it was not part of the world I knew at all. I felt my reality begin to blur, as if I was slipping between layers of the world and was not sure where one ended and another began. It was only when I stepped further that I noticed him, the old man. He was standing against the far wall, looking at me with his glassy eyes. He was there, in this dark space, but it seemed he wasn't quite alive. He didn't move, didn't speak. I wanted to ask him what was going on, but the words got stuck in my throat. I realized that I couldn't ask the question that was tormenting me anymore. I had become a part of this place, and it wasn't going to let me go. I tried to turn and leave, but I couldn't. My legs wouldn't obey me, as if I was tied to this place. I realized that this was exactly what the old man had warned me about. I couldn't leave because this place didn't let go of those who came here, and now I was a part of it, just like all the things on the shelves. Then I realized the terrible truth. This city, this store, all of it was a trap for those who didn't understand what was happening, and I was one of them. When I came to, it was dark. A deep silence surrounded me, and I felt the cold air restricting my movements. I didn't know how much time had passed, but I must have lost consciousness. At first, I thought it was just a bad dream, another nightmare from which I would soon wake up. However, when I opened my eyes, I was back in the same dark hallway, the same old store, only now it was more broken, more gloomy than ever. I tried to stand up, but my legs wouldn't obey me. They felt heavy, as if they were bound by something invisible, and I could barely move my toes. I felt my mind begin to lose its grip, as if the very air around me was becoming viscous and sticky. A constant darkness that seemed to thicken in the air filled everything around me, making it difficult to breathe. It wasn't just a place. It was something alive, something that sucked life in, like a mighty worm that devours everything in its path. I felt it swallowing me up, and the more I tried to fight it, the more I was pulled into that abyss. I looked around, but all I could see was a dim light barely penetrating through the murky windows. Suddenly, I realized that I didn't remember how I got here, how I walked this corridor, how I ended up in this place. I was trapped, and no amount of effort could get me out of here. Suddenly, I heard the sound of footsteps, thin, unnatural, almost inaudible, like the rustle of old pages in a book. It was more than just footsteps. It was the sound of someone coming out of the shadows to become a part of me. The footsteps were getting closer, and I realized that someone or something was moving in this dark space. I screamed, but my voice didn't break through the silence. It shrank, lost, as if it had been swallowed up by the space itself. My gaze darted around, trying to find the source of the sound, but I couldn't find anything that would explain what was happening. And then, out of the darkness, a figure appeared. I knew at once that it was the same old man I had seen before, but he looked different now. His face was dull, like an old drawing, worn away by time. His eyes, once empty, now glowed with a strange, inhuman brightness. He stood before me, and his shadow seemed to follow him like a living being. He was silent, but his presence was so strong that it seemed to press on me. I did not know what to do, and it seemed that everything around me was turning into a dream, a nightmare that had no beginning and no end. The old man approached me, and I felt the cold penetrate my very soul. He stood so close that I could discern every wrinkle, every fold of his clothes. His hands were covered with old skin that seemed so fragile that it could break at the slightest touch. But despite this, his movements were quick and precise. He looked at me as if he was trying to convey something that could not be said in words, and suddenly his voice cut through the silence. He said one word, but it was so loud and harsh that I cried out in pain. He said, "Shadows." I don't know why that word filled me with such terror. It was just a word, but there was something dark in the sound, something I couldn't understand. The shadows weren't just the absence of light. They were something more dangerous than any fear I could imagine. And when I thought about it, I realized that the shadows weren't just empty space. They were entities that ate up light, ate up time, ate up anything that seemed alive. I tried to push him away, but my arms were weak, as if they had lost all strength. He continued to stand in front of me, his eyes following my every move. I felt something dark sliding over my body. It was shadows that wrapped around me, something that was impossible to understand, but which I felt with every fiber of my being. The old man said again, "You can't leave. You're already here." My consciousness exploded from these words. I felt myself being pulled into the depths of darkness, into this soulless world, where there is no time, where there is no past and future. I tried to resist, but his words fell upon me like an invisible wall that fettered all my movements. I stayed here, in this place where shadows not only consume, but become part of those who come here, and now I was one of them. I realized that I couldn't escape. This store, this city, was a trap. I had become part of its dark corners, and it seemed that I was destined to be here forever, among these creatures, among these shadows that devoured all living things to turn them into meaningless emptiness. And when I looked at the old man again, he simply disappeared. His shadow dissolved into thin air, and I found myself alone again, swallowed up by this ominous place. At first I thought it was all a dream, that I would wake up, and it would all be an illusion, a hallucination. But time passed and I did not wake up. This place, its atmosphere, it was becoming reality. I sat in the darkness, surrounded by this gloomy space, and I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. The shadows were not just figures. They moved, changed, as if they too were aware that I was there. I felt their cold eyes, as if invisible, penetrating my soul, piercing every corner of my mind. I tried to stand up, but my legs wouldn't obey me. The cold that permeated the air froze my every movement. All my will, all my determination disappeared, as if I had found myself in a world where neither time nor space existed, only emptiness and darkness. I could no longer tell where this store ended and where reality began. I realized that I was trapped. My life was part of this place, part of this nightmare, and no one, not me, not anyone else, could get out of here. I was completely alone, or at least that's what it seemed like. But then something changed. I felt movement, very faint but noticeable. It wasn't like the old man's footsteps, but it was the same eerie, unnoticeable sound. It came from somewhere behind me, and I felt panic rising in me. I turned sharply, but saw nothing, only a shadow stretching across the floor, as if someone was moving in this world without light. I looked around again, and finally I noticed that the room I was in wasn't just empty. The walls, the ceiling, even the floor, everything seemed blurry, distorted, as if I was in some other dimension. I didn't understand what was happening, but the realization that this place probably didn't have a physical form shocked me. I tried to find a way out, only to find that the room was getting bigger and bigger. I moved down the hallway, its walls growing longer and longer, as if they wouldn't let me leave. I felt them tightening around me with every step, as if some invisible force was trying to keep me here. At some point, I realized that if I stayed here too long, I would become part of this place, a shadow that no longer had a past or a future, I had to find a way out, but how? Where was it? If this door was all I knew, where was I supposed to go? And then I saw it. At first it was just a slight movement in the shadows, but as I got closer it became clearer. The old man who had disappeared as suddenly as he had appeared was back in front of me. But now his face was even more distorted. It was not the same man I had spoken to at the beginning. His eyes did not glow with a strange light, they were empty. Just lifeless voids. He stood before me, and it seemed as if his figure was blurred, as if he were part of the air itself, part of this darkness. I tried to speak, but again I couldn't. Instead of words, only a muffled sound came out of my throat. The old man slowly raised his hand, and I realized that he wanted to show me something. He pointed to the wall. At first glance, it was just an old mirror, worn and dusty. But when I looked closer, I saw something moving in its reflection. It wasn't my reflection, it was me, but not the one standing in front of the mirror. It was a distorted, terrifying image, a face with eerie features, like someone who had died long ago and was trying to come back. I couldn't look away. My hands began to tremble. The mirror showed not only me, but also many shadows. They seemed to move around me, creeping up on me silently. I felt one of them slide over my body, leaving cold and pain in its wake. The old man pointed at me again. His gaze was heavy, and I realized he was trying to tell me something. But his words were as empty as his eyes. He couldn't speak. He was part of this place. It wasn't a living being, but a shadow of him, swallowed up by this world. My thoughts were confused. I no longer knew what was reality and what was a dream. I tried to break free, but my feet were stuck to the floor, and my thoughts were confused in this endless cycle. With every glance in the mirror, I saw parts of me dissolving into this world, becoming part of the shadows, part of this nightmare. I wasn't ready for this. I didn't want to become part of this dark void. At some point, I felt my powers disappear. Everything around me began to collapse. The shadows were shrinking, becoming thicker and more terrifying. I tried to fight, but no matter how I moved, they swallowed me more and more. The mirror was gone, and in its place was only emptiness. The old man was gone, as was the store itself. Only a shadow remained, which seemed to swallow everything. I stood in complete darkness. I didn't know how much time had passed. The silence was so thick that I couldn't breathe. It was a silence that swallowed up all sounds, leaving only emptiness. I wasn't sure if I was alive, but I knew one thing. I had become a part of this place. I didn't know how much time had passed since I had lost touch with reality. I didn't know where I was. I couldn't feel my body, as if it had become part of this darkness, dissolved into it. All I felt was the absolute emptiness that surrounded me, permeating every cell of my being. There was no more time or space. In this dark abyss, there was only me and something that was watching me. And this something was everywhere. I felt it in every breath, in every rustle. But one day, inexplicably, the silence began to dissipate. I heard no sounds, saw no light, but I felt the air around me begin to change. It grew warmer, as if someone invisible were lifting me to the surface from deep water. I tried to do something, but my hands still wouldn't obey. Instead, I felt my fingers, my palms begin to touch something familiar. Solid. Real. Little by little, a silhouette began to emerge in front of me, some strange light, dim and flickering. I couldn't understand what it was, but the sensations were disturbing. The light grew brighter, and when I tried to get closer, it seemed to retreat. I felt how step by step, without any obvious movement, I was getting closer to this source. Suddenly the light grew more intense, and I saw an old, creaky door in front of me, the same door through which I had entered that horrible store. I froze, unable to comprehend what was happening. I knew I had to leave. I knew that if I went back there I would not be able to get out, but I stepped forward anyway. The door opened by itself, and I found myself in the same room. Everything was the same as before. The same shelves, antiques, graceful figurines, and strange objects. But something had changed. The store was empty. No old man, no shadows, nothing. Just cold air that no longer seemed so hostile. It had even become a little warm. I stood in the center of the place, bathed in a faint light, and felt its tension gradually dissipate. It was a moment when I might have been at peace, if it hadn't been for the feeling that something was still watching me. Even as I looked around the empty space, I knew there was something watching, and it wasn't the old man. It wasn't the things, it was something far older and more powerful. Something that was part of this place. I turned to leave, but as soon as I stepped toward the exit, the door abruptly closed. Finding myself in the darkness, I froze when I heard a light knock. It was barely audible, but it couldn't be there. I was alone, I was sure of it. But the knock was repeated, as if someone had approached the door from the other side. I took a step back, looking at the door. At that moment it opened again, but now standing in the doorway was not the old man, but something completely different. It was blurry, almost invisible, like a shadow, but its outline was tangible. I felt a familiar sense of fear, a familiar cold grip that penetrated me to the very bones. It was like a memory of an old fear that I could not forget. The creature didn't move. It just stood there and watched me as I tried to figure out what to do. It was part of this. And in that moment, I realized that I couldn't leave unless I figured out what was happening. I couldn't just walk out because this place they wouldn't leave. I began to feel fear creeping through me. My legs were shaking, my breathing was ragged, but I stepped forward, not understanding what exactly I was supposed to do. I didn't know what to expect. But as I got closer, the creature standing in the doorway disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. And with it, Everything else disappeared. I stood before the empty door that led into this store, into this nightmare, and I knew one thing: I was free. But what kind of freedom? I didn't know. I couldn't forget that it was here that I had lost myself, that this place had become my nightmare, that its shadows still haunted me. As I stepped through the threshold, the world around me changed. Silence enveloped me again, but this time I felt like I could move on. This was not the end, but the beginning of something new. The shadows might not follow me anymore, but I knew they would remain, somewhere in the depths of this city, in those old objects that might still be waiting for their time. And although I was free from that world, I realized that my reality was now subject to its laws. Story 4. A couple of weeks ago, before I knew what was coming, I got a text from an unknown number. It came without warning, without context, just a few words. Your appointment is at 2:30 p.m., October 19th. Please arrive on time. No names, no details, just that short phrase, as if someone was letting me know about something important. At first, I just thought it was a mistake, that I had been texted to the wrong address. Maybe it was some random number. Maybe I was just on some spam bot's list sending out automatic reminders. I wasn't the type of person to write down appointments, especially weird ones like this. My life was a mess: missed deadlines, forgotten tasks, urgent rent payments, and constant trips to the grocery store where, of course, I always forgot something important. I didn't need things like schedules, meetings, and certainly didn't have time for inexplicable entries from unknown numbers. It seemed like no big deal, so I simply ignored the message, putting it off for later. But as often happens with things we put off, the next day I received a new message. Reminder, 2:30 p.m., October 19th. Don't be late. The same number, the same dry phrase. I looked at the screen and felt something strange. This reminder came at 3 a.m., when I usually wake up from the sound of an alarm clock or the noise of nightmares. That cold light of the screen that cut through the darkness of my bedroom turned out to be not so harmless. Almost instinctively, I picked up the phone and blocked the number. I felt awkward and even a little funny. Was someone really trying so hard to remind me of something? Maybe it was just spam or a strange mistake. But as you might have guessed, it didn't stop. The messages kept coming. Every day, over and over again, at the same time, always at 3 a.m. From different numbers, sometimes fake numbers, sometimes disposable ones. It was all the same, the text I'd already memorized, and these endless reminders that seemed to force me to return to them every time I closed my eyes. I'd wake up to the buzzing of my phone, the cold glow cutting through the darkness of the night, and that feeling in my stomach it wouldn't go away. My body responded to these messages as if they were something important, something that couldn't be ignored. I tried to figure out what was going on. Was it someone who had dialed the wrong number? Or was it some kind of game? But then I realized that these thoughts didn't make sense. I called my provider, explained that I needed to stop these messages. I was told that nothing could be done, that the numbers weren't tracked, that there was no pattern to find, so nothing would change. All of these responses sounded like I was just trying to justify my own fears. I always thought of myself as rational, but something was starting to rise up inside me, something dark and uncomfortable, like the feeling that someone was actually staring at me, and I couldn't just shake it off. The days went on and I kept waking up at night. The messages came every morning. I checked all the locks on the door, checked the windows several times, despite the fact that my apartment was on the 4th floor of an ordinary apartment building, and my doorbell had not worked for a long time. Paranoia, of course. I tried to calm myself down, but there was a strange feeling, as if someone could be closer than I thought. I did not know what was happening, but this feeling was getting stronger. Then October 19th came, and that's when I felt something had changed. It was almost like yesterday, like everything that had happened before seemed part of some other world. I woke up relieved that there had been no new messages today. Everything seemed to have quieted down that day, and I thought it was finally over. I certainly didn't relax completely, but still, I felt a little freer. At noon, my boss called me. He asked me to work an extra shift. I couldn't refuse. It was extra money, and I needed to somehow smooth out all those debts that I knew kept coming back like nagging reminders of real life. I was in the kitchen, which was, as always, a mess. The air was filled with the smell of fried food, a greasy film covered everything, and people were shouting that the meat was burnt. I didn't notice how quickly time was flying until I glanced at my watch. Suddenly, my stomach tightened. My chest tightened and I felt my heart begin to beat faster. It was too precise, too close. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that I shouldn't pay attention to it. But my hands wouldn't calm down and I felt them begin to shake. And then something incredible happened. At exactly 2:30 p.m., right on schedule, the power went out. The entire kitchen went dark. The lights, the ventilation, everything went out. All work stopped for a moment. There was absolute silence in the air, and only then did I hear something heavy fall in the back room. Something loud, heavy. I looked up, and my heart immediately jumped in my throat. There was only one word in my head: fear. My heart continued to pound so loudly that I thought it would burst out of my chest. In a second, the entire kitchen fell silent, so complete that I could hear my own breathing. The electricity went out, and a strange silence hung in the air. It was so ridiculous. The kitchen, which is usually bustling with activity, filled with noise and fuss, suddenly became silent, like in a horror movie. My body was frozen, as if at that moment I stopped feeling my limbs. I stood in the center of the kitchen, my eyes against the semi-darkness. And in my head there was only one thought, the thought that something was wrong here. It was like that tirade of text that night, when I felt like someone was watching me. But now it was all real. In the silence I heard the sound of something heavy falling in the back room. It wasn't just a box or some trash falling, it was something much more serious. A loud noise that cut through my nerves, making my hands break out in a cold sweat. I couldn't move, but I knew I had to go there, check out what was wrong. My colleague Javier was the first to grab the flashlight from under the counter. He looked a little confused, but he immediately started moving toward the back room, and I felt like I had to follow him. Even though I was standing in the middle of the kitchen, and my whole body was screaming at me to stay, I kept going. My feet were sticking to the tiles like I couldn't stand on a normal surface, but I forced myself to keep moving. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the empty building, too much. I could feel my heart pounding in my throat, and it was impossible to ignore. The back room was the weirdest part of the place where the supplies and the refrigerator were kept. It was a narrow, windowless space, and the light was always dim. And now, when we entered, everything was dark. Javier's flashlight illuminated the cold tiles, and then its light fell on the refrigerator door. The door was ajar, and there was a box on the floor next to it. It all looked like a normal warehouse though, but not the smell that was there. It was heavy, acrid, like chemicals, and I immediately felt uneasy. I was next to Javier, and my body was about to give in when he walked over to the fridge. I couldn't say anything, couldn't take my eyes off the open door. Javier didn't seem to notice anything strange, which made the situation even more ridiculous. He walked over to the fridge, reached for the handle, and started to open the door. At one point, I grabbed his hand, but before I could say anything, he pushed me away like I was a child and opened the fridge door. What I saw left me speechless. The fridge was empty, not just empty, but so empty that I felt a cold shiver run through my body. There were no packages of meat, no boxes of vegetables. Everything was empty, as if it had been gutted. The walls inside the fridge looked too clean. They were shiny, as if someone had run a cleaning product over them, leaving not a speck of dust behind. That empty fridge stared back at me with its sterile insides, and I felt my breathing become sharp. Thoughts flashed through my head, but they did not fit into a coherent picture. At this point, Javier muttered something and came even closer. But when I looked at him, he seemed different. He looked tense, and his face had become somehow unnatural. He slowed down, and I noticed how his face had become pale, as if he had forgotten how to blink. He approached the refrigerator door, but his gaze was strange, empty, and his hands were starting to shake. I could tell he was nervous, but I still couldn't take my eyes off the empty refrigerator. And then something caught my eye. On the floor next to the refrigerator, next to the stove, there was a folded piece of paper. It was carefully placed there, as if it had been left there on purpose. I walked closer and saw that the paper was printed in large, clear letters my name. I felt a tightening inside me. My blood stopped for a moment. I looked at Javier, but he was already in a different state, as if his attention had been lost. Javier picked up the paper and unfolded it. I stood there in complete silence, feeling something change in the air. But when he saw what was written, his face turned completely pale. He let go of the paper, and it fell straight to the floor. I stood there motionless, looking at what was on the paper, but I didn't have the strength to go and pick it up. On the sheet of paper was a photograph of me, exactly me, only the picture was taken from above, like from a security camera. It was the moment when I was standing in my kitchen. I was holding a knife in my hand, and the strangest thing was I didn't remember that moment. The knife was long, jagged, and the blade was stained with something. I had never seen a knife like that in my life. At the bottom of the photograph was written one word: "You're late." Those words hit me like an electric shock. I felt my legs go weak and my head start to spin. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what any of this meant. Javier threw the paper down and ran out of the room without saying a word. He ran like he was scared of something, and I couldn't understand why. I stood there, motionless, looking at the empty refrigerator and the photo. I couldn't believe it. It all seemed too absurd. I didn't know what to do, but I decided to leave. I ran out of that kitchen and told my boss that I had to leave because I was sick. My body couldn't stay still. I couldn't think. I went home and checked every corner of the apartment. I found nothing. But there was a scratch on the kitchen table, deep, fresh, as if something sharp had been dragged across the countertop. I couldn't shake this feeling that something was watching me, that someone had been there all this time. As I lay in bed, I thought maybe it was just my nerves, but at 3 a.m, when I heard my phone vibrate again, I knew it wasn't going to end. The text I'd seen before appeared on the screen again, rescheduled April 6th, 2:30 p.m. Please be on time. The day dragged on forever. I woke up at 7 a.m., feeling like I was on the verge of a breakdown. It was strange. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. All day I had to fight obsessive thoughts. I tried to do normal things, but they all seemed empty and mechanical. I walked around the apartment, checked the locks and windows, but the more I looked, the more helpless I felt. Every movement, every step, it was as if someone was nearby, but I couldn't find the one I was looking for. I tried to think about other things, to distract myself from this nightmare. I remembered how long it had taken me to start living a normal life after that strange night. But now that feeling was back. Messages, photos, those terrible words were spinning in my head. "You're late." What did it mean? Why me? Why them? I couldn't imagine the reasons. I had no enemies, I had no reason for this. I wasn't involved in any strange things, just an ordinary guy with an ordinary job and routine. But the more I tried to push these thoughts away, the clearer it became this was no accident. I could no longer hope that all this would go away on its own. The feeling of being watched became almost physical. I think I could even feel someone standing behind me. The room grew cold when I started thinking about it. Even in the middle of the day, I could feel goosebumps running across my skin. The hours dragged on sluggishly like thick tar, but the thought of the time ahead remained in my head. During the day, I checked my message on my phone twice. Same text. Rescheduled for April 6th, 2:30 p.m. Be on time. I didn't know what to do anymore. I started to think that I could go to the police, but a thought flashed through my mind. What if this was just a weird prank or someone's game? I was locked in this mental circle. But how to explain that moment with the refrigerator? How to explain the photo and the message on paper? When I tried to talk to someone, I found it hard to explain what exactly was going on. All I could say was that I was the victim of some kind of game, but it all seemed unbelievable. And then, as the evening came, I realized I couldn't wait. I had to get ready by 2:30. I felt that if I stayed home, it would continue, but if I left, maybe it would stop. It was terrible, such a battle in my head. I didn't know what to do, but the decision came to me anyway. I couldn't just sit and wait. I couldn't fall into that trap again. I decided that I would go to that place where they supposedly arranged to meet me. Yes, it sounded ridiculous, but I had no other options. I needed to know what was behind this strange message that had been tormenting me since I received it. I couldn't just sit and watch my life fall apart before my eyes. When the clock showed 14, I was already on my way out. My head was in complete disarray, and my heart was beating so hard that I felt a pulsation in my temples. Everything around me seemed distant and unreal. Every step, every glance, it all felt like a nightmare, and I didn't know where to go next. I didn't know where to go. There was no address in the message. All I knew was that I had to be on time. But how could I be on time if I had no address? Nothing to point me in the right direction. It seemed absurd. I pulled out my phone, hoping for some kind of clue, some kind of hint, but there was only that strange, unsettling message again, be on time. I started to panic, but in that moment I realized that if I didn't do anything, I couldn't avoid what was about to happen. I got into the car, drove out onto the street, but I didn't know where to go. The feeling that someone was watching me didn't leave me, and it grew stronger with each passing moment. My gaze darted around the mirrors and the surrounding streets, but nothing gave me peace. I didn't know what would happen when I got to this meeting, but my whole being screamed that I had to do it. I drove along familiar streets, but they seemed unrecognizable, and the longer I drove, the less confident I felt in my choice. It was getting closer and closer to 2:30 p.m. The roads were becoming increasingly empty, like some abandoned part of town. I was starting to think that this was all just my paranoia, that I was imagining things, but every kilometer I covered only increased my sense of anxiety. I knew that when I got there, something would happen. What exactly, I couldn't predict. All I knew was that I was about to encounter something I couldn't understand. The clock on my dashboard began to count down the final seconds. 2:29 p.m. I was pressed into my seat, my body tense as a string. I could feel the cold sweat running down my back, and in that moment it became clear to me I couldn't run from what was about to happen. Second, 2, 3. I stopped. The car was parked on an empty street, and there was a deathly silence all around. I glanced at my watch, 2:30 p.m. My fingers felt the cold sweat on the steering wheel. This feeling, the tension in the air that I could literally feel on my skin, was so strong that I could barely breathe. I didn't know where to go next, but I knew one thing: I couldn't go back. There was a house in front of me, but it wasn't the house I thought it was. It was old, with cracked walls, surrounded by a fence, as if it had been abandoned for many years. There were no signs of life in it, no cars, no people. Just the wind playing with the leaves. I didn't know why I was here. There was no address. I didn't need to be here, but I felt like this was the end of the road. Everything about this place made me feel like I was approaching something that was impossible to escape. I slowly got out of the car and looked around. The place was empty, uncomfortable and gloomy. Everything seemed unreal, like a nightmare. I wanted to get back into my car, lock the door and drive away, but something inside me made me keep going. There was no sound, no one, just my own footsteps on the asphalt, which seemed too loud in this absolute silence. I went to the door and froze. It was closed, but there were no signs or door handles. Just some strange scratch, as if something was trying hard to break through. I reached out and touched it. For a moment I thought I felt warmth coming from the door, as if someone was there, but I didn't know what to do. I stood there motionless and felt my heart beating too fast again. That was the moment I realized I was standing on the threshold of something unknown, inevitable. I had to discover it. I couldn't avoid it any longer. I pulled the door handle. At that moment it gave way easily, and I opened the door. It was both frightening and a relief. It was dark inside, but something unusual made me step inside. The room was empty. Only the old smell of dampness and mold filled the air. I walked further. Dark curtains hung along the walls, almost hiding the windows. I could see only the dim light that came through the cracks. My gaze fell on the center of the room, and at that moment I froze. There was another piece of paper on the floor, the same one I had seen in the refrigerator. Only this time it was on the white carpet, unfolded. Just like that time. My name in block letters was written right on it. I leaned over to read it, but didn't have time. At that moment I heard footsteps, not my own, but someone else's. They were quiet but distinct, echoing in the silence. I couldn't figure out where they were coming from. This wasn't a random noise. Someone was walking through this empty room. Someone was watching me. I froze, feeling goosebumps run down my spine. I tried to imagine who it could be, but I couldn't. These steps were too slow, too sure to be random. I wanted to scream, but my lips wouldn't obey. And then, at the most inopportune moment, I felt someone standing behind me. My chest tightened. My breathing became shallow. I couldn't turn around. I couldn't move. I just stood there, tensely waiting for something to happen. It was at that moment that I felt the light in the room begin to dim. It wasn't a normal light fading. It was something more sinister. I couldn't understand what was happening, but I didn't have the strength to comprehend it. All I knew was that I couldn't move anymore. The footsteps stopped and silence filled the room again. I stood there, paralyzed, with this strange sense of presence behind me. I didn't dare turn around. But then I realized there was something wrong with the air. It was different, as if something invisible was pressing down on me. When I finally turned to see what was happening, I saw him, standing by the door. He was just there, as if he had always been there. A man in a dark suit, his face clouded over, as if his features were blurred, but his eyes, they were bright. I couldn't figure out what was wrong with him, but I couldn't look away. I couldn't figure out where he had come from, but I knew he was part of this nightmare, part of everything I was trying to ignore. He didn't move. He didn't speak, but I knew his presence was the answer to all my questions. This was the end of the road, but I couldn't figure out what to do. He just stood there and looked at me, as if he knew that I couldn't leave, that I couldn't run away anymore. Then he turned and walked slowly away, leaving me in the darkness, feeling like I was now trapped. I woke up. It was morning, but not the morning I expected. At first I couldn't figure out where I was. The silence was so absolute that even the sounds of my breathing seemed alien. I tried to get up, but my body wouldn't obey, as if it refused to perform the simplest movements. I couldn't tear myself away from this feeling, the feeling of being watched. My heart was pounding in my chest like crazy, but I couldn't understand what had happened. My gaze ran absently around the room. The same empty furnishings, the same darkness as the night I came here. The walls were covered in a layer of dust. The air was damp and heavy, and even the carpets under my feet seemed part of some nightmare. But everything was so familiar. I noticed my phone. It was on the table next to my bed, as always, but something was wrong. It was vibrating, as if someone was trying to call, but I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard it. I picked it up slowly, feeling the cold metal, which at that moment seemed completely foreign. There it was again, April 6th, 2:30 p.m. Beyond time. What does this mean? Why is this happening again? How did I get here? I couldn't remember how I ended up in this place. Last night, or was it the night before? I didn't know. My head was splitting with pain, and despite this constant fear, I felt like I needed to find an answer. I stood up, trying to ignore the dizziness. My body resisted, but I couldn't stop. I needed to check what was going on and find an answer to this question that was bothering me. Who was this man in a suit? Why was he following me? And what was this place I had come to? I went to the window and looked out. Nothing had changed. The same street, the same empty house, the same dead trees, no movement. But something had changed in me. I was sure that I was here for a reason. I needed to understand what all this meant. I decided to check the door, but as soon as I touched the handle, it opened by itself. A strange feeling came over me as I stepped over the threshold, as if this entire room was part of one big dream. It was empty, except that now, in addition to the paper with my name on it, there were several more photographs lying on the table. I held one up to my eyes. It was a picture of me, not a photo from a security camera, but it was just like the one I'd seen in the fridge. It was a picture of my face, but it was mangled, as if someone had tried to erase all of my features from the start. I felt the blood drain from my face, and my fingers went cold. But even in its mangled state, I knew it wasn't just a picture. It was part of something bigger, part of something I couldn't understand. I put the photo back on the table, but then something strange caught my eye. There was an old cabinet in the corner of the room. It was dark and closed, with worn wood that looked like it had survived decades in this abandoned room. I didn't know what made me approach it, but I felt like I needed to. I opened the closet door, and inside I saw things: old books, clothes, broken toys. But there was one thing that caught my eye, lying at the very bottom. It was an old leather journal. I picked it up, feeling its stiff pages rustle between my fingers. It was strange, as if I knew this journal was important. I opened it, and on the first page there were only a few lines written in a handwriting I recognized, but it was not my handwriting. It was the handwriting of the man in the suit. I began to read. You thought you could escape this, but I'm always here. You can't hide. Everything you do is already recorded. We know where you'll be. We'll always be watching. My hands began to shake. I couldn't believe what I was reading. It was impossible, but the reality was too obvious. Everything I thought I knew was a lie. I was part of something much bigger and darker than I could ever imagine. I felt my blood run cold. This journal wasn't just a letter. It was a warning. They were watching me. I was trapped. My nerves gave out. I needed to get out, to leave, but something held me back. I smelled that strange smell again, the smell of dampness and something unspeakable that hung in the air. It was everywhere, like the taste of metal in the air. Then I heard the footsteps again. The footsteps were close, too close. It wasn't just my imagination. Someone was here. I couldn't stay any longer. I quickly put the journal back and rushed to the door, but when I opened it, I was faced with emptiness. There was no one, and yet I knew someone was watching me. No matter how hard I tried to run, no matter what I did, it was impossible to avoid. I realized that I was part of something that I couldn't get out of, and it kept happening. With every step, with every moment, I was only sinking deeper into the dark waters of this nightmare. But I had to move on, no matter what. Time was running out, and I knew that if I didn't make it in time, I would become a part of this world forever. I didn't know how much time had passed until I was back in that car, still holding the diary, hidden under the seat. My heart was still beating too fast, and my thoughts were jumbled in my head, like an old cassette tape stuck in a tape recorder. I couldn't understand what was happening, what was wrong with me. Had I just gone crazy? The road I was driving on was the same, but now, as I passed familiar houses, everything seemed foreign. All these streets, these signs, they didn't seem to belong to this world. I tried to force myself to focus on something normal, that I needed to get home, that I could leave all this behind. But the feeling of being followed wouldn't leave me. It was like an invisible thread pulling me where I didn't want to go. I passed another gas station, and again my gaze stopped at the old building that I had seen when I was driving here. It was the same house that had been empty and abandoned, but now it seemed to me that there was someone in it. I didn't know what was calling me, but despite my fear, I turned in its direction, without any reason, simply because it was necessary. I stopped near the house, and this time I didn't expect anything. But the moment I got out of the car, I knew it was inevitable. The walls of this place were talking to me. Every crack in the facade, every extra step to the side, seemed to pull me into the depths of something I couldn't understand. I walked towards the door, and this time it opened by itself. When I walked in, it was different this time. The room didn't have the usual darkness and dampness. Everything was bright, almost clear, but the feeling of this light was strange, as if something was pulling at it, making it dim. It wasn't natural light, more like artificial light, and the smell in the air was different. I could feel it literally seeping into me, like chemicals in my blood. It was terrifying. The same table, the same cabinet, but now everything looked too clean. Something wasn't the same as before. I couldn't stop. I went to the cabinet again. I opened it, and this time there was no diary. But something else caught my attention. There was an old box in the corner. It was closed but not sealed. I picked it up, feeling how heavy it was in my palms. I opened the box. There were only a few objects, but they were strange. They didn't belong to anyone in the room. There was an old watch, sealed in a box, the case worn but the glass perfectly clean, and a tiny photograph. It was a photograph of me, but this time I was standing next to a man I didn't know. He looked just like the man in the suit, only his face was blurry, as if it was hidden. His eyes were dark, like a shadow. I felt a burning fear come over me. I was sure that this was not just a dream. It was something more. All these objects, all these traces that I left behind me, they were starting to form a picture, and I could no longer ignore what was happening. I looked up, and there was the man again. He was standing in the doorway, but I couldn't see his face now. He was like a shadow, a threat that haunted me. He stood there, motionless, as if waiting for me to figure out what I needed to do. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. I just stood there, feeling that gaze, that pressure getting to me. It felt so much like a trap, but I knew I couldn't give up. I tried to step aside, but he wouldn't let me. He was right in front of me. I felt his presence, as if it was penetrating me, as if he was a part of me.
And then I realized that everything that was happening was not an accident. I was chosen. This was not just a random set of events. I was part of this nightmare, and now there was no turning back. But what else could I do? Everything in this place, in this room, and these objects, they were connected. And I realized that my attempts to escape would not succeed. I had to accept it. I had to accept its presence. I couldn't fight it. All I could do was give in. I looked at him again. His eyes were full of something I couldn't understand. He stepped aside and gave me room to move. I turned around and my feet carried me. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew it was the only way left.
Story 5. I couldn't believe it was happening again. My neighbor's kids kept knocking on my door, even though they'd been dead for 5 years. Last night it started again. 3 quiet knocks, just like the last 4 nights. 2 in the morning, just like before. Knock, knock, knock. I knew I shouldn't have opened the door. I knew this had to be a nightmare, that I should just ignore it and move on with my life. But when you hear children's voices whispering your name in the dark, when you see their silhouettes pressed against the frosted glass of the door, it's impossible to ignore. It's impossible to tell yourself that this is all some kind of terrible dream, that this is a mistake, that they just can't be here. It's impossible not to hope that this is all some kind of terrible mistake that will soon end. I watched them die. Their house caught fire in the middle of the night. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing out of the ordinary. Faulty wiring, they said later. But as I watched the fire consume their home, I knew there was nothing I could do. It was my fault. I could have run out and tried to help. I could have screamed, run to their door, tried to save them. But I didn't. I stood by the window, clutching the blanket, watching the Wilsons' house go up in flames. The children were inside, the parents too. I heard them screaming, but I said nothing. I did nothing. I knew it was too late. I knew that by the time I got outside, they would be lost. I was a coward. That hadn't changed. The parents' bodies were found later, melted and charred in that very room. But the children, they were never found. After weeks of searching, their bodies were still missing. There were only tiny handprints on the floor of the house. They led to the door, footprints that living people don't leave. There were deep claw marks on the door, but wild animals don't knock. I still can't shake that memory. When I needed to do something, I just stood there and watched. And now, 5 years later, they come again. Last night, as I sat in my chair reading a book, the knocking started again. It was the same as before. It didn't stop. 3 knocks on the door. A few seconds later, 2 more. 4 nights in a row it happened. It was strange that I kept listening to it. Maybe it was stupid, but I still opened the door, as if I hoped that it was all a lie, that they were actually alive and just playing with me. I couldn't ignore them. But yesterday, when I opened the door, there was no one, nothing but empty silence. And I was about to close it when I heard it again, a whisper, like children were talking on the other side. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring into the void as the light from the bulb stretched along the walls and ceiling. Silence broken only by my breathing. Suddenly something clicked, and I heard that sound again, a knock. But now it wasn't coming from the door. Now it was coming from the walls. I couldn't understand what was happening. The sounds, the clicks, the scraping sounds like fingernails scraping against drywall. I knew now that I wasn't just hallucinating. This was happening. I tried to ignore it, told myself it was all just a coincidence. But the fear wouldn't leave me. It wouldn't go away. It was digging its claws into my head. It wasn't many minutes later before I heard the whispers again. They were talking. The Wilson children, I could make out their voices, the same ones I'd heard the night they died. I heard them laughing, low and ominous. I knew they knew I was watching them. I knew they could see me. Why didn't I help? Why did I stand there and do nothing? I felt the coldness running through my skin. I could feel them close. But how could I explain it? What could I do? I thought that this might all just be nonsense, that I should just close myself off and forget. But I couldn't. My hands wouldn't obey me. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I thought again that maybe if I opened the door it would all go away. But I didn't open the door. I couldn't. The Wilson children were no longer just shadows on the glass. They were walking on the walls. They were moving from room to room. I could hear their footsteps. They were getting closer. Closer. I locked the doors and windows again, forcing myself to breathe evenly. I thought everything would be fine, but their voices grew louder. They weren't going to leave. I could hear their discontent. I knew they wanted something from me. They asked me why I didn't help. Why didn't I save them? Why did I just watch their house burn? I didn't know what to answer them. I felt only one fear, which hit me like a hammer. This fear was real. It was stronger than me. The silence returned only after I locked everything again. But I knew I can't wait. I can't just sit and be silent. I can't stay in this house. The kids didn't go away. They wouldn't leave me alone. And I didn't know what to do next. When I woke up the next morning, my entire skin was cold and my eyes couldn't tear themselves away from the dark corners of the room. The walls seemed to have closed in, as if they were pressing in on me, absorbing my every move. But that wasn't the scariest thing. What was scary was that I knew they were there. I couldn't ignore that fact any longer, no matter how much I wanted to. All night I couldn't sleep, couldn't shake the sounds that echoed in my mind. Whispers, scratching, scraping, walls and mirrors. I was sure I wasn't imagining it. It couldn't be a simple figment of my imagination. I saw handprints appear on the walls, things move in the mirror, reflections take on a life of their own. It was all real. Did I really have to live with this? When I got out of bed, I felt as if there was someone in the room, despite the emptiness around me. It felt like someone was watching me. I tried to forget about the events of the night and concentrate on the morning's activities. But every glance at the walls, the floor, the windows, everything reminded me of what happened last night. I saw how stains remained on the surface of the mirror, not disappearing, as if someone was wiping it with someone else's hands. I went to the kitchen and poured myself a cup of coffee, but it tasted empty. It didn't give me the comfort I expected. My body was tense, and my mind was filled with thoughts of what had happened in the Wilsons' house. The whole street had woken up from their screams, and I had woken up too, but I didn't do anything. The children were dead. I knew their bodies would never be found, but now it seemed as if their spirits were not leaving, they were returning. And they wanted something from me. Maybe they were expecting an apology or revenge? And why me? Why was I one of the few people who lived in this house, who might have heard their screams, but did nothing to help them? When I returned to my room, I noticed that something had changed. On the walls, as if they had not been there that morning, there were new marks. Small, barely noticeable, fingerprints, smudges. They were everywhere. On the furniture, on the doors, on the floors, almost like invisible traces left by those who should not have been here. I came closer, my hands sliding along the walls, and felt my skin tighten with disgust. I knew it wasn't just dust, it wasn't just footprints. It was something else. I smelled the smoke that couldn't leave this house. It smelled like that night, like the fire was still burning somewhere in the dark corners where no one could see it. But the scariest thing was that I could still hear their voices. They didn't go away, even when I tried to cover my ears and pretend that it was all just a dream. Still, despite this, I felt their presence. I felt them walking around the house, watching my every step. After a while, as I stood by the window, trying to come to my senses, I saw something strange. In the window, reflected in the glass, I saw several figures. Children. Their silhouettes. They were there, right behind the glass. How could I not notice it? I came closer, and realized that they were not just reflected in the glass. They were there, in reality, but I could not touch them. I tried to open the window, but it did not give in, as if someone from the inside was holding it closed. Then I realized these aren't just memories. These aren't just ghosts. These are them, the Wilson children. They haven't left this world. They're here. They've come to tell me something, to demand something from me, and I didn't know what. I decided to leave the house. It was a strange decision, but the only one. I thought that if I left this place, everything would stop, but something held me back. Doubt, fear, uncertainty. I couldn't just up and leave, no matter how much I wanted to. When I went outside, I looked back and was overcome with horror. I saw that the windows of my house were covered with some kind of film, something I definitely didn't remember putting there. I walked closer and noticed that the film on the windows was on the outside, as if someone was watching me from inside. I didn't know what to do next, go back to the house, or run away without looking back. But I knew one thing, I could no longer stay here. I felt their gaze, their presence. I could no longer hide from their arrival. I turned around and stepped into the car. The key caught in the lock and I felt my hands shaking. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay here, and maybe next night they would be knocking on my door again. I left the city, not knowing where to go. With every kilometer I felt the weight growing, as if time itself was slowly shrinking around me, and the air was growing thicker. I kept looking out the window at the darkness, trying to make myself believe that if I went farther I could forget. But the memories haunted me, and the shadows that seemed like flickers in the night would not let go. The car was silent, except for the noise of the engine and the whistle of the wind. I could feel the chair piercing my back, and my nerves were tense as a string. Every turn, every bend in the road seemed familiar, as if I were moving along an unknown path that I had once traveled before, only I could not remember it. Time became unimportant in this place. It was as if it did not exist. I turned onto one of the country roads when I noticed the lights on the dashboard started to flash. I didn't think I was going to run out of fuel, but the alarm left me no choice. I figured I'd stop for a bit and found a place to park, a small roadside diner that I didn't expect much from, but it seemed like it would be my refuge for a few minutes. When I parked, I noticed that there was no one outside. All the cafes, the entire parking lot empty. But something was still alarming. The weather was strange, as if the night was even deeper than it should have been. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I got out of the car and walked towards the cafe. It was dim and uninviting inside. The feeling that this place had been abandoned for a long time did not leave me. Faded advertising posters hung on the walls, and the tables looked as dusty as everything else. It was like some movie where you know something is about to happen, but you don't understand what exactly. I walked up to the counter and knocked on it, trying to get attention, but no one answered. Then I thought I'd better go around the corner. Maybe there would be someone in the backyard. I knew there probably wouldn't be a soul there, but I had no other choice. My footsteps echoed in the empty hallway as I made my way there. There was a small courtyard, almost completely hidden from the outside world, with old benches and trash cans. And it was there that I noticed something that made me stop. On one of the walls, right next to the trash cans, someone was drawing something strange. It was almost imperceptible, but clearly visible, like the marks I saw on the walls of my house. Scratches, lines that crisscrossed, forming a pattern like fingers scratched into a wall. I leaned in to take a closer look and realized that the marks were too fresh, as if someone had left them recently. Almost incredulous, I tore my gaze away from them. But as soon as I did, something strange happened. There was a flicker of movement in one of the cafe windows. I turned around sharply, but saw no one. It wasn't just a trick of the light. I was sure I saw a shadow that quickly disappeared into the darkness. I felt a chill down my spine, and my whole body tensed up. I got back in the car and drove on again, even though the thought was ringing in my head that I might be trapped again. But I was too scared to stop, and too worried about what was happening around me. I moved along the road, empty and unfriendly, but questions kept spinning in my head. What was going on? Why couldn't I shake the feeling that all this was more than just a coincidence? How was it all connected? And what did they want from me? As I passed empty houses, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching the windows. I quickened my pace, but every turn in the road made me feel an invisible presence growing closer. I was sure they were there, in those houses, the shadows, the ones I had left behind. I felt my shoulders tighten, the blood in my veins freeze. It was more than fear. It was like a task I couldn't escape, like an unknown threat watching me. But the scariest thing was that I felt that they knew more about me than I did. These children, these shadows, they whisper, they are close, and I cannot escape them, no matter how far I go. I turned off the road again, to find myself back in that same place where there was no one. But I already knew, no matter where I went, they would follow me. When I returned to my house, I felt that something had changed dramatically. It seemed as if the world around me was warping, and I, as if in some kind of nightmare game, was losing all connection with reality. The evening was dark and lifeless, and my house seemed even emptier than before. I had no peace. The fear that had long settled inside me now manifested itself in every rustle, every movement, even in the shadows, which with each passing day became more and more tangible. I walked into the house with the feeling that it wasn't the walls that greeted me, but the space itself, as if it had been waiting for me to be there again. Its emptiness was deceptive. The silence, which was usually pleasant, now seemed thick and oppressive, and I didn't know how to cope. I stepped into the hallway and immediately noticed that something was wrong. The lights were flickering dimly, as if the voltage in the network was only increasing with each passing minute. I stood there, holding my breath, looking for the source of this strange sensation, but found nothing. But then I noticed it. Something had changed in the mirror that hung directly in front of me. My reflection seemed wrong. It was flickering. I didn't understand what exactly was happening. I tried to turn around, but my gaze was involuntarily drawn to that mirror again. The reflection didn't repeat my movements. It seemed to linger a millisecond later. I froze in place, trying to understand what was happening. I felt anxiety seize me, something elusive and frightening settled in that mirror. There was something strange about it. I didn't know what exactly, but it made me not look away. I came closer. I saw myself in the mirror, but there was something wrong with my posture. I stood straight, but my reflection was tilted to the side, as if someone was standing behind me and holding me at their mercy. My heart pounded in my chest. I was sure there was no one in the room. I looked around, but saw nothing but myself standing in front of the mirror. I took a step back, but the reflection did not repeat my actions. It remained as motionless and tense as before. It became difficult for me to breathe. I turned away from the mirror, trying to clear my head of unnecessary thoughts, but that look continued to haunt me. I understood that if I stood in this house, I would not be able to get rid of these feelings. They would still return. Something was hiding in these walls in this house, and it was watching me. Soon, after I had walked a few more steps, I heard a sound, a faint rustling sound, like something rustling quietly at the other end of the house. I froze and listened, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. It was coming from inside the walls. I felt a cold sweat run down my skin. The walls, these sounds, these noises, it had all become part of this place. I followed the sound up the stairs, but the closer I got to the source, the more I felt the space around me shrink. My footsteps echoed in the empty rooms, and the air became thicker and thicker, as if it were getting stuck in my lungs. I reached the top floor. The sound grew louder, no longer just a rustling, but an insistent scratching. It was the same sound I had heard before, when I was still downstairs, but now it was much closer. I approached the door of one of the rooms, which was always closed. There was something there that I could not understand, something that kept me in this place, not letting me leave. I stood in front of it, looking at it, and every time I got closer, I felt the sound become more distinct. I hesitated to open the door. Why would I want to? I already knew he was there. Behind the door, behind the walls, something that was haunting me, something I couldn't understand, but I felt with my whole being. It wasn't just fear, it was something more that wouldn't let me leave. And then, after a few minutes of silence, I heard it again, knocking on the door, knocking on the wall, repeating over and over, as if someone was trying to break through. I couldn't help myself and opened the door. I didn't know what was there, but it was stronger than me. When I entered the room, I saw something that made me freeze. The walls were covered in marks. These marks, they were there before, but now they were brighter, more distinct. It was dark inside the room, but I could clearly see the lines of these marks scratched on the floor, on the walls, as if someone was trying to get out. I didn't know what to do. I stood there motionless, just looking at those footprints that stretched from one corner of the room to the other until they disappeared into the darkness. I wanted to leave, but I couldn't. It was like I was trapped. I stood in this room shrouded in a fog that seemed to absorb everything: sound, light, thoughts. The walls were covered in marks, scratches, and the more I looked at these lines, the more I began to feel them becoming a part of me. It wasn't just a sight, it was a physical presence. My body tightened. I felt a cold that penetrated me, and my breathing became heavy and shallow. The whole room seemed to slow down, to take me in. I knew I had to leave, but my body wouldn't budge. I stood there, motionless, watching the shadows on the walls begin to move. They weren't just changing, they were becoming real, as if there were hands behind them, eyes. I felt someone invisible but familiar touch my skin. I turned sharply and tried to leave, but there was that sound again in front of the door. A knock. It was coming from the wall itself. Not the one I was trying to examine, but from another one. It was at the level of my ear, but too quiet to be perceived as real. And yet it was there, and it was getting louder. I pressed myself against the wall, holding my breath, not daring to turn around. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The sound, the tracks, the tense silence, all of it made me feel like I was part of something terrible, something that couldn't be comprehended by my mind. My vision was darkening, and I didn't understand what exactly was holding me back from simply running away from here, instead of standing there, submitting to this pressure. But then I understood. I understood that I was not alone. At some point, the walls around me seemed to shift, and I saw them. They stood there, motionless, their small silhouettes indistinct, but I could feel them, as if they were literally swallowing up the space. Their faces were reflected in the mirror I was trying to ignore, strange and alien. I couldn't figure out where they had come from, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that they were there. Small, pale, with eyes that expressed nothing, they looked straight at me. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. All I did was stand there, staring at those empty faces, like a pathetic caricature of someone. There was no life in their eyes, but there was something else, something more than death, something that was too terrible to understand. They didn't move, but their presence covered me completely. Every step I took was reflected in their eyes. I felt as if they were watching me at every moment, not letting go for a second. I didn't know how long I stood in this tension. Minutes stretched into hours, and my body felt every moment as if it were slowing down, as if time was interrupted. Then I felt the sound coming from the wall again, that horrible scratching sound. I turned around and saw a small crack appear in the wall, gradually widening. Before I realized what was happening, it had grown so large that I could see something beginning to appear in that space that was nothing but darkness. At first it was just a small shadow, but the further it spread, the clearer it became that it was not just a crack. It was something bigger, something that could not be part of the world I lived in. I stood glued to the wall, unable to move. The scratching sound continued to tear through the air, increasing the pressure on my chest, and with each passing moment, I felt it becoming more and more difficult to breathe. Dark shapes like hands began to stretch out from the crack, as if penetrating the space. I saw their shadows as they moved, moving with that hard intent that left a sense of unease in their wake. I didn't need to understand what was happening. It was obvious. What I was seeing was something different, something that couldn't be explained. I had spent too much time trying to make sense of the chaos, too much effort trying to understand what was happening. But now I knew one thing. I was not who I seemed. I wasn't sure that this, what had come here, was me. And perhaps I could no longer be who I had been before. My whole life, this house, these walls, all of it became nothing more than a stage for something else, for something that watched me from this dark crack, from this mirror, from these eyes. I walked towards the exit, not thinking about what I was doing. Only when I was outside could I take a deep breath. But I knew this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning of something new. That day was hard. When I found myself back on the street, the world seemed normal, but only on the surface. Everything looked the same as always, but inside I felt like I had lost something important. No, not just lost. I felt like something inside me had become empty, as if something great had gone, leaving only traces in the dark corners of my soul. I tried to find an explanation for everything that had happened, but the more I thought about it, the more it became clear that it was impossible. How can you understand something that goes beyond logic, beyond the usual? How can you understand something that cannot be explained in words, that cannot be understood through everyday perception? But now I knew one thing: it would not end. I felt that they were following me, no matter where I was. In every corner, in every reflection they were, and they knew me, knew what I did, what I saw. My gaze kept sliding around the world, and I noticed strange things, flickering behind the windows, vague shadows that disappeared as soon as I tried to focus on them. I didn't know what was happening, but I felt their presence, and every step, every glance, even when I returned to my house, became part of a game that I couldn't help but join. I understood that it wasn't me who was controlling events. They were watching me, and that was much more frightening. I returned home, but I couldn't stop thinking about what was waiting for me inside. As I stood in front of the door, I felt an icy feeling come over me. I didn't want to go in, but I had to. It was as if this house wasn't mine anymore, as if I was just its shadow. And the shadows, the ones I used to notice at night, were now a part of me. They followed me like my own fear. I walked into the hallway and immediately felt that everything was different. The air was heavy and dense, and everything around me seemed strangely unnatural. I noticed that the same sound was coming from inside the walls again. It wasn't just a rustling sound. It was something deeper, something that stretched out in time and space, as if the very essence of the house was trying to tell me something I couldn't understand. I stood at the door, hearing them coming closer, and how their every move echoed in this house. They were everywhere, and I knew I couldn't escape them. All I could do was stand and listen. That was all I could do. Every now and then, I tried to run out of the house, but it was as if something was holding me back. I tried to escape this labyrinth, but the steps seemed to tie me to this place. I couldn't understand what was holding me here, but one thing was clear: I wasn't safe. They were in the mirrors. Their faces, those empty, meaningless faces, appeared in the reflections. I saw them in every surface, in every glass. They stood there in the shadows, ready to take the next step, but I didn't know what it meant. That evening, when I tried to lock myself in the bathroom for some privacy, I heard them again. It wasn't just a whisper. It was something loud, something unimaginable, as if the whole house had suddenly entered into resonance. The walls began to shake, and I felt a cold sweat slide down my back. It wasn't just movement in the walls. It was something more. I tried to leave it all behind, but I couldn't. I turned around and saw it, a face that wasn't mine. It was in the reflection, not in the mirror, but in the glass in the window. I didn't know how it happened, but it was there. My face, but not me. I felt everything inside me tighten. I didn't know how to act. I tried to turn around to leave, but suddenly I remembered that I had seen this moment, this scene, this horror. It wasn't just a reflection. It wasn't just an image. It was something that was watching, that was following me, and I couldn't get rid of it. The shadows were getting closer and the world seemed so fragile. I knew something was going to happen and I couldn't stop it. I realized they had been with me for a long time, and not just in these walls. They were inside me. I sat on the couch, my arms wrapped around my knees, trying to somehow keep my mind from breaking down. My thoughts were tangled like a ball of wire, each new turn tangling me further. What had happened? Why had all this happened? Why was I back in this house, surrounded by the shadow of something invisible, yet ever present? They were here. I knew that for sure. But what if I had become part of this nightmare? Night had fallen over the city, and with each passing moment I felt worse. My gaze slid over the old photographs on the walls, and I noticed something strange. At first I didn't understand what it was, but when I looked closer, I realized that the eyes of the people in the photographs were gone, and not just gone, they were scratched out, as if someone was trying to hide their presence. But that was only the beginning. In some of the photographs, they appeared again, the Wilson children. In one of the photographs, they were standing behind me, but in a way I didn't remember. I didn't even know when it was taken. How many more photographs were there in the house where I hadn't noticed their presence? I couldn't understand it, but I felt them, their gaze, full of hatred and pain. My hands were shaking, and I picked up my phone. It was showing the same text I'd received that morning. "Why did you leave the door open?" I didn't know who had written it. I hadn't left the door open. I always checked the locks. But what if it wasn't me? What if someone else had been driving my life this whole time? And if that was true, who was the one who sent the text? Fear gripped my heart, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't understand what was happening, and it made me lose touch with reality more and more. I stood up, threw my phone on the table, and walked to the door. I was afraid, but I knew what I needed to see. I opened the door, and there was no one in front of me. However, there was another note on the threshold. "You shouldn't have stayed here. You know this won't end." I closed the door and, without realizing what I was doing, I found myself back in the bathroom. I was trying to find some place to feel safe in here. I sat on the floor and thought about how I hadn't just been an observer all this time. I had been a part of this. My fear, my memories, my mistakes, they were all tied to this house, to these children, to their deaths. I was the one who had done nothing to help. But why? Why couldn't I do anything? Why was I standing there when it all happened? I didn't know the answer. I didn't know why I didn't run into the fire or run outside or try to save someone. I was there. I heard the screams, I saw the smoke, I felt the fear, but I didn't do anything. Why? My thoughts were in turmoil, and I felt despair creeping up on me. I closed my eyes, hoping for a moment of peace, but in that moment I heard the noise again. It was familiar. It was their footsteps, the Wilson children. Their footsteps echoing off the walls. I opened my eyes and saw a dark silhouette rushing down the corridor. I couldn't move. I was frozen. They were inside me, inside these walls. But what did they want? Why did they come again? And why don't I remember them, even though it all happened right before my eyes? I stood up and walked to the mirror. It was clean, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't me reflected in it. I looked into my eyes, but there was nothing alive there. It was someone else's gaze. It wasn't mine. I felt it. Then I heard it again. That sound I'd tried to ignore for so long, scratching on the mirror. It was so loud my ears popped. I turned and saw a crack stretching across the mirror, like something was trying to break out. And it seemed to have almost succeeded. I didn't know what to do. I was trapped. These children, this house, this unbearable shadow that followed me. It all had no end. I tried to find an explanation, to find logic in it all, but nothing worked. The more I tried to understand, the more I lost touch with reality. And at that moment, when I looked in the mirror again, I realized I was no longer here. This was not me. I had become part of this nightmare, part of their shadow. And now I was not the one looking at them, but the one they saw. They were inside me, in every cell, in every corner of my soul. I raised my hands and my fingers felt the cracks in the glass. I felt them coming closer, moving in the dark corners, the dark places I had tried to ignore for so long. And suddenly I knew I would never leave. I would be here, in these shadows, in their eyes watching me. And if I ever did, it would not be me. Story 6. I woke up to the sound of trumpets. Not just music, it was something else. Deep, old, like wind instruments forgotten by time and hidden under many layers of earth. They sounded like a call from long-forgotten eras, when man had not yet learned to fear sounds and did not know that some of them could resurrect the most ancient fears. I felt how low vibrations penetrated every cell of my body, making me wary, like an animal that sensed the approach of danger. These pipes did not sing, they howled. And it was not just a sound, it was some kind of call, something that pulled me, beckoned, and at the same time filled my heart with anxiety. Everything that could exist in our world and in others was in this sound, in this ancient vibration. I sat up in bed, feeling the cold wooden floorboards touch my bare feet. I tried to stand up, but my body wouldn't obey. Some kind of icy fear gripped every muscle, and it took me several long seconds to overcome the feeling and stand up. The sound of the pipes continued, invisible but real, as if penetrating the walls of my house, through every crack and crevice. It was everywhere, and in its deep hum I heard strange resonances that merged with the life of the city itself. It was not loud, but the deep, low frequencies vibrated so that it seemed to pound my skull. When I went to the window, I saw the city beginning to wake up. It was getting light, but there was no usual morning calm. There was something different in the air, unclear and disturbing. The wind was not blowing. No, the wind was frozen, as if the air itself was locked in an invisible cage, unable to move. I opened the window, and the sound of the trumpets grew louder. It penetrated my ears, and I felt it tremble in my bones. There was no doubt, this was not just music. It was a call that tormented the soul, like an ancient pain, familiar and inevitable. Something was near, something that was meant to come. Turning, I saw the townspeople beginning to gather in the streets. It was strange. It seemed like a weekday, but they were all dressed as if for Sunday service. I noticed old Pastor Elijah standing in front of the chapel. He was wearing his white robe, and it was fluttering around him as if it were a living being caught in an invisible wind. There was no fear in his eyes, only awe. I had never seen him like that. He was as if in a trance, his head raised to the sky, his body expressing not only anticipation, but also the certainty that this was what he had been waiting for all his life. His arms were spread wide, and his gaze was directed to the sky. "They are here," he cried with the greatest confidence. "The angels have come, as the Lord promised." I couldn't understand what he meant, but suddenly I realized that all the people standing around him, including my mother, were falling to their knees, as if they were all suddenly realizing that the world had come to its end, ready to face what was coming. It was scary. They were crying. Someone was praying. I felt the tension growing, as if a fog was slowly rising from the ground and enveloping everything. A strange parade. But I couldn't take my eyes off the sky. Deep within it, something began to change. It was a strange shimmer, not like the sun's rays, but like the air itself was beginning to crack, as if it were being torn apart. A hole opened in the blue dome of the sky, and through it came a light unlike any I had ever seen. It was cold, murky, like the sky before a storm, but without clouds. It had a shape, and despite its vagueness, I realized that they were wings, or something very like that. At first it looked as if the people themselves were rising, but they were not. It was not just a moment of admiration or surprise. The people standing around were rising, very slowly at first, but with each passing moment they were moving further and further away from the ground, as if they were being pulled by an invisible force. Their feet were leaving the ground, and their bodies were moving slowly upward, without fear, without struggle. They were not crying, not screaming. Their faces were clouded, either with delight or madness. It was something I could not understand. I could not even believe that all this was happening. I saw my mother disappear among the people. She, too, rose into the air, her nightgown billowing around her, as if she were not a person but simply part of something much larger. I tried to call her, reached out to her, but I could not speak. My hand passed through her body as if through a fog. Her face was calm, and there was no pain or fear in it. It was a smile. I could not understand why she was smiling like that, why her face was the way it was. Everyone around me was disappearing, as if carried away by this strange light. Then I felt something happening. The sky became dark and the light disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. All the bodies that had been lifted into the air disappeared, dissolved, and with them the sounds and the light disappeared, leaving only silence. The silence was deafening. I stood alone in this world where there were no people, no sounds. I was the only one left on this earth. I stood in the same place where I had just watched everyone I knew disappear. At first I didn't realize what had happened. My brain, like a frozen machine, couldn't immediately process reality. It was like that moment between sleep and wakefulness, when you don't quite understand what's going on around you. Everything was quiet, so quiet that even the air seemed frozen. No wind, no noise. Gradually, like in a nightmare, realizations began to come. I felt my heart beat faster, and my breathing became more rapid. Something in my body began to squeeze my chest, and I felt a slight headache that, like the sound of the pipes, did not go away. There were no people, not a single living creature around. The world was empty. Empty and endless, like a huge abandoned planet on which there had once been life. I started moving. My legs were leading me somewhere I didn't know where. Fear tormented me, but I still went. Everything around me seemed familiar, but at the same time strange. Houses, roads, trees, they were all as I knew them, but something was wrong. The lines of the buildings were unclear, as if reality itself was losing its shape, as if something important was shifting, defying perception. I kept walking, despite the growing uneasiness. My footsteps echoed in the emptiness, and the sound seemed to be the only thing that reminded me that I was alive. I thought about my home, my family, how it could have been. Why were they gone? Why was I alone? On the street, near the central square, I noticed a small church, and its doors were open, as if someone had forgotten to close them. Something made me approach, despite the strange anxiety that did not leave me. I entered the church. It was dark, but not entirely. The light that had once illuminated the streets now filtered dimly through the large windows, where stained glass depicted scenes from the sacred history. A simple but strange light filled the room, making the shadows move as if they were alive. In the shadows, in the very darkness of the temple, something moved. I froze, listening. It was not real movement, but rather a shadow from something that was only on the edge of visibility. A shadow that was trying to become something more than just darkness. I came closer. In the center of the room stood an old altar, but it was not what I expected. The table was destroyed, the cross was broken, and around lay some strange objects, like ancient books, on which there were no words, no letters, only unimaginable symbols that I could not understand. I walked up to one of them and bent down. I felt the coldness that came from the book, and when I touched it, I thought I heard someone's voice. It wasn't anything specific, not words, but rather a subtle vibration that penetrated my consciousness. It wasn't a human voice. It wasn't just a thought. It was something beyond my knowledge. But I knew that this voice had been with me for a long time. It had always been here. My fingers were shaking, but I couldn't take my hands off the book. I felt some force pulling me towards it, as if forcing me to read. I opened the page and saw something that immediately made me step back. It was a drawing. It wasn't detailed, more like outlines, contours, but they were so familiar that I was scared. The same sign I had seen on the stained glass window in the church. It was on the ring, in front of everyone standing in that strange parade on the street. It was a symbol of something I couldn't understand. I turned, feeling the air in the church become heavy. Something was changing in this place. I tried to find a way out, but every time I turned, the passages became longer, and the space seemed to expand. Suddenly I heard footsteps. At first I thought it was just my ears playing tricks on me, but then the footsteps became louder. They didn't sound like mine, they were someone else's. I turned around. I saw her. She was standing at the end of the passage. Her silhouette was half dark like a vague shadow, but I recognized her immediately. It was my mother. She was not smiling. Her face was covered with wrinkles, but these were not the wrinkles of old age. These were traces of pain, an excruciating pain that I could not explain. She looked at me with eyes full of longing, and her gaze was so incomprehensible. I felt how cold I was, and how something cold and alien was penetrating me. "You came," she said, but it wasn't her voice. It was a voice I didn't know, a voice that was familiar but not hers. It sounded like something old, from a time that didn't exist. I stood in the shadows, trying to figure out what was happening, but my mind was so jumbled that no thought could find its place. There was silence around me, but it was not calm. It was a heavy, oppressive silence that pressed down, as if the air was becoming thick and unbearable. My breathing became rapid, and my hands were cold. I tried to force myself to step forward, but my body refused to move, as if some invisible force was holding it down. My mother stood before me. She was there, but she wasn't. I could see her silhouette, but something about her presence didn't match reality. She wasn't the woman I knew. There was no familiar care in her eyes or even weariness. Instead, I saw only emptiness, only an eternal, relentless longing. She was there, but not for me, and that was worse than if she hadn't been there at all. "You came," she repeated, and I felt her words chill my soul. This wasn't just a conversation. This was something else, something out of this world. This voice, it seemed to penetrate me, fettering my mind and soul. I tried to say something, but my tongue wouldn't work. Instead of words, only a strangled sound came out of my throat, and I tried to take a step again. But she did it before me. She stepped forward, and I felt as if someone had pushed me, as if she were a force acting against me. Her movements were smooth, but too fast, too precise. She came very close and stopped. I saw her face, almost point blank, but there was no fear, no love, nothing human in it. I opened my mouth, but again I couldn't say anything. My mother stood in front of me, her eyes empty, her face lifeless. "You don't understand, do you?" Her voice penetrated my head again, as if she were not speaking but thinking out loud. "You will never understand what happened." Her words echoed in my head, and at that moment I felt something change behind me. The space around me became more and more unnatural. I turned around. This time there were no footsteps, no sign that anyone else had arrived. But still, something had changed. A man, or rather, something that could not be a man, appeared in the corner of the church. He was like a shadow, but I knew he was more than a shadow. He stood there, motionless, and I felt his gaze on me, even though his face was hidden in the darkness. Everything about him seemed alien and unreal. He was not a being, but rather an emptiness filled with intent. I tried to look away, but I couldn't. His presence was too strong. It was like that oppressive feeling when someone is watching you without you noticing, but you can't escape. I turned back to my mother, but she stood there, no emotion on her face, and again, her eyes empty and cold. "You have to understand," she continued. "No one can come back. This place, it's not for you. You've been here too long. You have to go." I looked at her, and again, a vague feeling flashed through my mind, as if something was wrong. My mother had always been there, always ready to support me, and now, something was wrong. I tried to speak, tried to ask what had happened, why everything had changed, why her, and why I was here alone. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I felt her gaze again, and then the gaze of the creature that stood in the corner, motionless, silent. "You need to go." Her voice became a little more urgent, but I couldn't figure out what she meant. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was an order. And something in her words made me believe that she actually knew something more, something I couldn't understand and wasn't supposed to understand. I turned to leave, but as soon as I took a step, the room began to change. It changed, but not in the way I expected. The walls began to stretch, and the floor began to disappear. Mother was disappearing, and then, as if wiping away her presence, other objects disappeared. First it was the church. Then the emptiness around me became thicker and thicker until I felt like I was losing the feeling of the ground beneath my feet. The walls began to break, as if they were made of paper. Everything around me became elusive. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't obey, as if they were sinking into something heavy, endless. I turned again, but now there was no one. Everything was gone, just me and that emptiness. I woke up, but it took me a moment to realize where I was. My body felt like it had been on a long journey, and it took me a few seconds to realize that I was lying on a cold wooden floor. It was as cold as the air I had breathed in when I woke up, but it was also filled with a strange smell, the smell of dampness and earth, something ancient and forgotten. My gaze immediately fell on the surrounding space. There was a light somewhere nearby, dim and flickering, like from an old lamp hanging in the corner. I tried to get up, but my body was heavy, as if everything that had happened before had left a mark on me that did not allow me to move. I clenched my teeth and still rose on my elbows. My head was spinning, and shadows swam before my eyes. This place was alien, incomprehensible. There were no familiar sounds here. There was no noise from the city, no breath of nature that I might have heard if I had been in the woods. There was only silence, a deep, lifeless silence. I turned around, trying to find some landmarks, but the rooms, the walls, everything seemed strange. The closest was a wooden door, covered in dust and cobwebs. There was no handle or lock on it, as if the door had been long forgotten. I stood up, leaning on the table, but my hands were slippery and my fingers slipped. Unable to hold on, I took a swaying step toward the door, feeling the cold air that seemed even thicker than everything around me. There was something strange in my every movement, as if the air itself was resisting my actions. I felt my legs buckling, and as soon as I reached the door, I put my hand on it to support myself. Opening the door, I found myself in an even stranger room. There were no windows, no light, just endless dark corridors that led to nowhere. I froze for a moment, but something about this place pulled me forward, a strange pull, as if someone knew I had to move on. I took a step, then another. At that moment, I heard something strange. Sounds that weren't like normal sounds. It wasn't something tangible, but rather a feeling that the space around me was changing. Rustles, quiet steps, whispers seemed to be coming from somewhere inside. My body tensed. I stopped, listening, but again, I didn't hear anything specific, only vague, indefinite sounds that made me move even faster. It took me a while to realize that I might be in some kind of labyrinth. The corridors twisted and changed, as if a hidden hand was drawing new paths where I had just been. I kept walking and walking, and despite the strange feeling that I was trapped, that this place wouldn't let me leave, I kept moving. Silence filled the air again, and now I realized that there was nothing holding me back anymore. The fear was gone, leaving only a boundless curiosity. I began to notice details that would have gone unnoticed before. Golden streams of light that shimmered somewhere far away between walls that seemed too thin to be real, and a feeling that I was not alone. And I was not. As I walked through a few more corridors, I found myself in a strange room that was completely unlike anything I had seen before. There was a table in the center, but there was no food or items on it, just emptiness. I walked closer and finally looked at it, but instead of seeing a simple wooden table, I saw something else, rings, as if they were carved right into the surface, circles that moved, as if they were alive. My fingers instinctively reached for them, and at that moment I felt something inside me become alarmed. Everything around me began to tremble, and the space seemed to become foggy. It wasn't evil, but it was something I couldn't control. I pulled my hands back and took a few steps back, feeling the room shrinking around me. At that moment, I realized I couldn't leave. This labyrinth wasn't just built to lock me in, it was a part of me, and now I was a part of it. I tried to find a way out, but every turn only confused me more. The further I moved, the more I felt this labyrinth absorbing me. It became not just the space around me, but something more alive. It felt like the walls here were not just standing, but breathing, that the air was saturated with some kind of intense force that suppressed my consciousness. I stopped, trying to collect my thoughts, but everything in my head was becoming more and more foggy. I couldn't understand what was happening, why I couldn't get out of here, why every movement was burdened with this strange heaviness. Everything seemed to be saturated with fog, and not only around me, but inside me. Fog in my mind, fog in the air. I knew I had to keep going. Something was pulling me forward, not letting me stop. At some point, I didn't even pay attention to the strange sounds that kept coming all around me. Footsteps, rustling sounds, a barely audible voice. I realized that they were a part of me. I was a part of this place, and it was a part of me. At one turn, I came across what might have been a door. It was unremarkable like the others in this place, but I felt like this was the moment I had to go in to move on. As I grabbed the cold, metal handle, I felt something inside me tighten, as if the space I had just come from had compressed and left me without air. My fingers froze for a moment, and then I forced the door open. Another corridor opened up before me, but this time everything was different. It was like a corridor I had been in before, but there was something new here. It was darker, as if the shadows had swallowed up the light, and even the air was different, thicker, heavier, and now it seemed almost alive. I stood there, feeling the cold creeping into my bones, but I couldn't take my eyes off what lay before me. There were strange, barely noticeable lines running along the corridor. They flickered with a dim light, as if they were reflected from something I couldn't see. They led somewhere. Again, I felt a strange force pulling me toward this path. My feet moved, even if I tried to slow down. As I walked further, I began to notice that the walls were not only becoming dark, but also empty. No texture, no detail, just a smooth surface, as if someone had decided to erase everything that could mark them. I walked further and further until I found myself in another room. In the center of the room stood a figure, shrouded in semi-darkness. It was not a person, not a creature, but something that had no form that I could recognize. Something about this creature attracted me, but at the same time I felt it pressing on me, as if its presence was dragging me into the deepest oblivion. I froze. It was not something sinister, not something evil, but the sensation I experienced was painful. Not physically, but psychologically. I wanted to retreat, but suddenly something about this creature changed. The shadows around it began to move. as if the darkness itself was wrapping itself around it, as if it were an extension of it, and as if by law my gaze was directed there again, not allowing me to turn away. Then the creature spoke, but not with words. Its words were not words, but simply feelings. I could not understand what it was saying to me, but I felt every message. It was like an echo that brews in your mind, forcing you to accept it even if you don't want to. You are here for a reason, the voice said, and I felt the vibrations penetrate me, causing it to perceive everything around me as a single entity. My heart started beating faster. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what was happening, but in that moment it became clear to me that I was standing on the edge of something important. Maybe everything I knew before didn't matter. All I could feel was the sensation of being in a place that was dominating me. Time ceased to matter, and my own actions became uncontrollable. And then I realized I wasn't looking for a way out. I was looking for an answer. Story 7. Idleness isn't exactly a pleasant state to be in, especially when you're not idle by choice. I spent 2 weeks on the edge, waking up around lunchtime, staring at the ceiling, eating cup noodles, and thinking about how quickly money runs out when you don't have any. I used to work, no matter who I did. The main thing was that the money was trickling in, and then it stopped. The job closed, layoffs, a crisis, business as usual. I wasn't surprised. I was just left with an empty fridge, debts, and silence ringing in my ears. I was 29, and I had no purpose, no plan. On my 10th day of unemployment, I got a letter. Not an email, a real one, a paper one. In my mailbox, between a pizza ad and a flyer about a missing cat. The envelope was white, no return address, no recipient's name, just neat like it came from a stationery set. Inside, a card, black background, white letters, real work, real pay, real speed. No logo, no company name, just a QR code. I wasn't one of those who immediately ran to scan everything, but I didn't consider myself cautious either. I stared at that card for a long time. I thought it was probably some kind of decoy, another scam. But then I remembered looking at the half-empty shelf with expired stew and how the smell of the refrigerator made me want to puke. Desperation makes you flexible. You stop seeing red flags, especially when they drown in the gray background of everyday survival. I pointed the camera. The QR code led to a page that wasn't protected by a certificate, with a single button, Install Grinstone. It was the first time I'd heard of this app. It wasn't in the App Store. It wasn't in Google Play either. That should have been a warning sign, but the button was neat, the interface clean. Black background, white letters, modern design, no frills. I installed it. The first thing I saw was the Get Started button. No registration, no card linking, no identity verification, just a button. I clicked it. The first task appeared immediately. Leave a 5-star review for SunUp Logistics on Yelp. Below it was a pre-written text with boilerplate phrases about excellent service and reliable delivery. I copied the text, found the company, if it was a real company, and pasted the review. 5 minutes later, the app updated. My balance, $10. In a virtual account. Of course, the money wasn't real, I thought, until I saw it arrive in my PayPal account. Immediately. $10 for 5 minutes of phoniness. The next task was no less simple. Mark a post on a social network as malicious. Then, like the page, subscribe to the channel, make a short video praising an energy drink with a name I've never heard before. For each step, from $15 to $50. In a day, I earned $400. In 3, $1,200. Everything came instantly. The app did not glitch. Completed, you get. No calls, no letters, no explanations. Just tasks, just money. I started getting into it. I even started making a schedule for myself. Morning, simple tasks. Afternoon, the ones that take time. At night, the weirdest ones. But they were all harmless, almost. I pushed away the thoughts that these actions could be part of something big and disgusting. I convinced myself that this was just unconventional marketing, a new form of SMEM. Black PR, viral content. The money was real. So as long as I was getting paid, everything was under control. On the 4th day, the task looked different. Black screen. Red letters. Task. Leave a dead rat on the porch of a house 1849. Redacted. Average pay, $500. I stared at the screen for a long time. My fingers were sweating. The address was nearby, less than 10 blocks. I could walk there. I even knew the neighborhood, a residential area, old houses, shabby porches, quiet. I closed the app, but the notification came right away. The rat has been delivered. See the package at the door. I looked out. There was a black plastic container on the threshold, sealed like a mini fridge. No identifying marks. I opened it. Inside, vacuum sealed, lay a dead rat. Cold. Eyes turned inside out, first stuck to its body as if it had been dipped in oil. I put it in my backpack. I went to the address. No one was there. I put the rat on the porch as instructed and left. I walked quickly, without looking back. My heart was beating as if I had just escaped from a crime scene. The money arrived in 20 seconds. $500. Into the account. No delays. I came home and sat in the dark for a long time. Didn't eat, didn't sleep. I tried to explain to myself that this was just a weird performance. That someone was conducting a social experiment. Or filming with a hidden camera. But something inside me turned over. I felt that now everything would change. Now the tasks would be different. The app was silent until the morning. I almost decided to delete it, but I couldn't. Holding the icon didn't give any result. The cross didn't appear. It wasn't even in the app settings. I restarted the phone, Grinstone started itself when turned on. In the background, it didn't stop. A new task appeared in the morning. Task: follow the man in the gray hood. Take 3 photos. Payment $1,200. I didn't think I'd take it, but I did. Because once you hit get started, there's no turning back. The next task popped up on the screen. Simple at first glance. Selfie in the mirror. Stand with your back to the darkness. $250. I sat on the edge of the bed for about 10 minutes, staring at the screen, trying to convince myself that this was just a test. Some kind of creepy psychological prank. Maybe someone was recording my reactions. Maybe this was part of the show, a hidden camera. I had already broken all the boundaries, tossed a dead rat, followed a stranger, carried something heavy into the forest, something that moved. Compared to this, a photo in the bathroom. Fuck. But at that moment, something inside me shook. I turned on the light and went into the bathroom. The window was tightly closed, but the air felt damp, as if someone had just taken a long shower. I hadn't. Drops of water were spreading in the corner of the mirror. The glass was cloudy, but I stood in front of it anyway. I held out my hand with the phone. I turned on the camera. The flickering light under the ceiling began to blink, as if warning. I stood as directed, with my back to the darkness and my face to the mirror. I pressed the button. Click. The flash tore out my silhouette in reflection for a split second. I looked at the screen. In the photo, I stood with my hand outstretched. But my reflection, it wasn't me. It was smiling. I wasn't smiling. Its eyes were looking right into mine. Too aware, too alive. It knew. Enough. A new message appeared on the screen. Task: look at the photograph. Carefully, I slowly zoomed in. The reflection in the mirror seemed slightly distorted. The angle of the smile was unnatural. But that wasn't what was scary. In the corner, behind my shoulder, at the far edge of the frame, in the shower, stood something. A woman, pale, wet hair clinging to her face. Her mouth was too open, as if she were screaming, but I couldn't hear anything. Her eyes, or rather their absence, were black holes, empty, deep, an abyss, staring at me through the mirror. I turned around so abruptly that my shoulder hit the sink. The shower curtain was slightly open. There was no one there. The tiles were dry, just a faint smell of dampness and something rotten. I turned off the light, then turned it back on. I leaned against the door, breathing heavily. The phone screen flickered, and a new task appeared. Task: now you've seen her. You're marked. She's part of your life. Introduce her to someone else. Payment. There's silence. The link to the app appeared just below. The text turned red, the color of blood, the color of alarm, the color of warning. I felt my stomach tighten. I felt sick. I sank to the floor and just sat there. I couldn't delete the app. It wouldn't close. It wouldn't unload. It just was. That night I didn't sleep. The lights were on all over the apartment. I covered all the mirrors with towels. I broke the mirror in the bathroom. I smashed it on the floor and threw the pieces down the garbage chute, trying not to look at them. I saw her in every reflection. I was sure she hadn't left. In 3 days, a new assignment. Tough. Without explanations. Without unnecessary lines. Task: she's coming. Pick someone. Quickly. Timer. 6 hours. The timer started counting down. 6 hours. 5 hours 59 minutes. 5 hours 58. I didn't know what would happen if it hit 0, but I felt it. Nothing good. Grindstone wasn't just paying. It was feeding. Feeding someone. Or something. I couldn't decide for a long time. I went through my contacts. People I hadn't spoken to in a long time. Neighbors. Old acquaintances. No one came to mind until I remembered my brother. We hadn't spoken for years. We had a fight over trivial things. He was the only one I could write to and not feel guilty. I sent the link. Said it was a game. Fast money. No risks. He took the bait. Laughed. Called me crazy, but still downloaded it. The first task was simple. Film yourself sleeping. Surveillance. Harmless. He did it that same night. The next morning I received a message from him. Why is there a woman crawling on my ceiling? A couple of minutes later. She's inside the walls. And then, silence. The app notified me that the task was completed. She found a new home. I didn't feel relief, just emptiness. As if I had sold not my soul, but something more intimate. More personal. Something that could never be returned. The phone was broken. The shards were in the river. I bought a new one. A new number. Moved to another city. A new house. A new life. Or so it seemed to me, until the package arrived. The first days after my escape were like a dream, in which I was still falling. The city I had moved to seemed foreign to me, even from a distance. The streets had no smell. The faces of passersby had no contours. I drank a lot of coffee, smoked, even though I had quit a year ago and hardly left the house. The only thing I achieved was silence. Not a single new task. No notifications. No hint of Grinstone's existence. The silence was thick and sticky, as if I was not safe but waiting. I began to hope that this was all psychosis. Overexertion, hallucinations, perhaps a virus that had damaged the system. I had almost convinced myself of it, until that morning. The package was lying by the door, a regular cardboard box sealed with black tape. No sender's address, no markings, not even a barcode, just my name, handwritten. I opened the door and looked around. No one. No courier, no car. Silence. I didn't want to pick it up. I didn't want to feel that again. I already knew what was inside. I knew exactly what was inside, but I picked it up anyway, carried it inside, and put it on the table. Inside was a phone. New, black with a white logo on the back. It was already turned on. Battery was at 100%. The screen was bright. It only had one app, Grindstone. I didn't touch the screen. I didn't even want to look at it, but it opened itself, without touching. It just flashed. New task. Task, your brother failed. She returned. You owe us. Bring someone to the herd. Now, timer, 001459. I didn't immediately understand what these words meant. I didn't want to understand. I stood over the table, my heart pounding somewhere in my throat. 14 minutes. 14 minutes to pass this on to someone else. Otherwise what? I knew it was different. I felt movement behind me, a barely perceptible trembling of the air, the smell of mold, dampness, and rot. She was already here, somewhere nearby, waiting. I locked all the doors, closed all the windows, drawn the curtains, removed the mirrors. Even the TV screen covered with cloth. Anything that could reflect, show her. I heard rustling in the walls again, first in the living room, then closer. It was as if someone was dragging wet hair across the floor, or dragging a body. The timer was ticking. 12 minutes. I picked up the phone. My hands were shaking. I scrolled through the contacts. No one. Only 3 numbers. Taxi, old doctor, and food delivery. No one allowed. No one allowed. But she wouldn't give me time. I remembered one person, a woman I had met by chance in the park a week ago. A few words, a short meeting. She was strangely open. Told me she had recently moved, left her number. I hadn't planned on calling, but now I didn't know what to do. 10 minutes. I felt the house begin to breathe, as if the walls were sucking in the air along with me. I heard the floor in the bedroom creak. She was coming. I don't want to hurt anyone, but I don't want to die either, or disappear, or become a reflection that doesn't match my face. I didn't know what would happen if the timer hit 0, but I knew it would hurt, slowly, deeply. 7 minutes. I unlocked my phone, entered the number, didn't write, just sent the link. Grindstone immediately notified me. The link is active. The application is downloaded. I cried, not from relief, not from fear, but from being a part of this. I was no longer just a victim. I had passed it on. The house fell silent. It was as if someone had exhaled. The air became lighter. The sounds were gone. The timer was gone. The app was updated. A new screen, a gray background, a simple inscription. Thank you. She's on the road. Rest. I dropped my phone on the floor. It didn't break. It didn't even turn off. It just sat there glowing. I sat in the corner of the room, covering my face with my hands. I thought it would make me feel better, but instead there was emptiness. Something inside me broke. Silently, invisibly, but forever. I can't look at reflections anymore. Even in other people's eyes, I think she's there behind their pupils, looking, waiting. But the worst thing is that I'm starting to get used to it, to get used to the fact that she's always somewhere nearby, behind my back, in the corner of the room, under the bed. I feel her breath when I fall asleep. I thought that would be the end of it. I completed the task. I passed on the link. I became a link in this chain, and although it tore me apart inside, I consoled myself with the thought that I did everything to survive. But Grindstone doesn't go away. It doesn't let go, even when you do what it asks. The next day, I woke up to a vibration. The phone I'd thrown under my bed was back on the nightstand, as if it had never left. The screen was lit. I knew what I'd see there. I looked anyway. New task ready. I tried not to look. I turned away, stood up, went to the kitchen, poured myself some water. The water tasted metallic, or maybe it was the rust in my mouth. I felt like they were looking at me. I turned around. The phone was lying on the windowsill, as if it had climbed there itself. The screen was on. The notification was blinking, pulsating. I walked over slowly and read it. Task. Clean the bathroom mirror. Look at yourself for 60 seconds. Don't look away. Don't blink. Payment, $1,000. I felt my insides tighten again. They knew. They knew I was hiding the mirrors, that I was afraid of them. This wasn't a mission. It was a game. Playing with my fears. They were having fun. I went into the bathroom. The humidity was still in the air, as if someone had been breathing in the room all night. I pulled the cover off the mirror. It was cloudy, covered in dust and what looked like condensation. I ran my hand over it, and a clear oval remained on the glass. My face appeared in it, as if it were breaking through a thin veil. I didn't want to look, but I started counting. 60, 59, 58. At first, everything was quiet, just my breathing and the occasional flickering of the light above my head. But at the 40-second mark, my reflection did something I didn't do. It tilted its head to the side. I froze. I stood straight. It tilted its head, as if listening. My reflection's lips began to move, without a sound. It was whispering something. Its eyes grew wider. I no longer recognized myself. This face belonged to me, but it was empty. A face without inner light, as if someone was looking at it from within, trying on my skin. I counted to 0, closed my eyes, hit the sink, opened my eyes. The reflection matched again. I had received a notification. Task completed. Payment credited. I covered the mirror again, but the fear didn't go away. I began to notice reflections taking on lives of their own. Glass in the window, a puddle in the bathroom, even the shiny screen of a switched-off TV. If you stare too long, you notice movement, a shadow that isn't yours, a sharp blink when you remain still. I began to refuse light. Light emphasizes mirror surfaces shine. I replaced the light bulbs with weak ones. I did not open the curtains. I lived as if in an abandoned theater, where the stage is empty, but there is someone behind the scenes. Grindstone continued. More tasks. Some were harmless. Set up a camera in front of a house. Record a person walking down the street. Note a car's license plate. There was money. Lots of it. Instantly. Every time. And every time a feeling of guilt came with it, as if I was being paid not for work, but for betrayal. Then came a task that I couldn't complete. Task: remove the face from the photo. Use scissors. Do not leave the eye. Payment $3,000. I opened the photo. It was me, 5 years old, grinning from ear to ear. New bike. A photo I love. My mom kept it framed. I didn't know how Grindstone got it. I didn't even remember that I had a digital version. But there it was on the screen. And the task was to remove the face. Cut out the eyes. As if I were my own judge, my own executioner. I put the phone down. For an hour. For 2. It wouldn't turn off. It was like an alarm that wouldn't go off. 3 hours later, the screen turned red. The text appeared. Expired. Warning. And the silence in the house ended. First I heard a scratching sound, like someone was running a fingernail along the inside of the wall. Then footsteps. Not heavy. No. Soft like bare feet on carpet. Then breathing. I knew that breathing. I heard it that night in the closet when the timer was almost to 0. She's back. I grabbed the phone. Gave up. Opened the photo again. Cut it out. My hands were shaking. The scissors were slipping. I left the eyes. I couldn't. The screen flickered. Incomplete execution. Warning. I threw the phone in the sink. Turned on the water. Hot. Let it drown. Let it burn. Let it disappear. But a minute later, he was lying on the bedroom floor again, and it was dry. I don't know how much longer I can keep going. Every morning starts the same way, with anxiety. Not just anxiety, but an animal fear, deep, irrational, like I'm prey and someone is hunting. Grindstone doesn't back down. It doesn't tolerate refusal. It doesn't forgive procrastination. It's breathing down my neck. I fell into a routine. Wake up. Check if my phone is on. Check if I have a task. Hide reflections. Close the curtains. Don't make noise. Don't look out the windows. Live as if I don't exist. And then a new task came. Task: send a package. Address inside. Do not open. Do not ask questions. Payment: $6,000. I went downstairs. There was a box by the door. Black. No identifying marks. Cold to the touch. Very heavy. An envelope with an address attached to it. I didn't know the area, but it was on the other side of town. I had to cross the center, the crowded streets, go outside. I hadn't been out for 2 weeks. I'd order food to a neighbor's address and pick it up at the door. But now, I could feel Grindstone pressing in. I knew that if I didn't do it, it would get worse. I dressed as inconspicuously as possible. Hood, mask, glasses. Took the box. Called a taxi. The driver didn't ask anything, just glanced in the rearview mirror. I turned away. As I walked, I noticed that the city had become different. Something had changed. In the people, in the rhythm, as if everything I knew was slowly creeping into distortion. The ads on the billboards were empty. The shop windows were taped over from the inside. People were sitting at the bus stops with phones, identical to mine. They were looking into them as if into an abyss. When we pulled up to the address, I immediately realized it was a trap. The house was abandoned. Broken windows, charred walls, but I couldn't retreat. I went out. Climbed the rotten steps, put the box by the door, stepped back. Just as I wanted to turn around and leave, the door slowly opened. There was no one there. The darkness inside the house was thick as fabric. I stood there, holding my breath. From inside came the smell of dampness and age, and something else, something sweet and rotten. And then the box disappeared. I didn't blink. I didn't turn, but she was just gone, as if someone had pulled her in. The door closed. With a dull click, a notification appeared on the phone screen. Task completed. Payment credited, but the money didn't matter anymore. I felt everything inside me turn upside down. I had given something away, something important, something that couldn't be given away. I was no longer just a performer. I was a participant. On the way back, I felt like I was being watched. People on the streets turned their heads, even though I was just a shadow among them. One man stopped, looked straight into my eyes and whispered, "She's looking for a way out." I quickened my pace. The taxi didn't come. I walked. The closer I got to the house, the more it seemed to me that I wasn't alone. The shadows became thicker. The steps became softer. The cold became deeper. I entered the house and locked the door behind me with all the locks. And then I understood. Grindstone is not just an app anymore. It is inside, in the house, in the mirrors, in the reflections on spoons, on the laptop screen, in the wet tiles in the kitchen. It breathes through the walls. It uses me as a conduit. I am not the center. I am just a tube through which it leaks into reality. I tried to destroy the phone again. I smashed it on the floor. I threw the pieces down the garbage chute. An hour later, it was lying on my desk, whole and brand new. The screen was black. There was no text on it. An image. Me, sleeping, taken from the ceiling. I didn't set up any cameras. I don't sleep anymore. I started hearing her again. She's in the bathroom. She's in the mirror that I've covered up, but it still reflects. I can feel the reflection breathing. It doesn't match mine. It lives its own life. One day I woke up with blood on my pillow. I had cuts on my arms, deep, not fatal, but clear, even as if they were done with special care. The phone was blinking. Task: she studies you. Continue. Payment: your breath. I don't know what's next. I'm not sure how many more missions I have to take, but I've learned one thing: Grindstone isn't a job. It's not a job. It's a contract, a one-sided one, with a creature that hides in technology, in the shadows, in our fears. It uses us to get out. Every click, every mission, a crack in the fabric between worlds. I no longer accept payments. I don't want to pay for it. I thought the end would come in silence, that Grinstone would simply disappear, dissolve, if I stopped feeding it attention. But no, it doesn't go away. It lurks. It's been 5 days since the last mission. That's a record. No notifications, no messages. Just emptiness. It's worse than the constant hum, because I know that when it's quiet, something is coming. I don't live anymore, I exist. I sleep in fits and starts, fully clothed with the lights on. I eat rarely. I hide mirrors. I don't look at shadows. I don't check the news. I don't communicate. I don't call. My world is my apartment, 4 walls, and him. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I hear my phone ring. One short beep, then silence. I turn it on, nothing. Blank screen, black as an abyss. But I know it's not a glitch. It's a warning. On the 6th day, I woke up with the feeling that someone was watching me. The feeling was warm, alive, like a gaze on the back of my head. I stood up and walked around the apartment. No one. Everything was closed. Everything was under control. And yet, there was already a new message on the phone screen. Task, the final step. Accept her. Let her finish. Payment, release. No timer. No instructions. Just this. I sat down on the floor. The phone was lying in front of me. I looked at it like it was a mine. My whole body was buzzing with tension like a taut wire. I didn't know what it meant to accept her. Allow her to enter? Allow her to possess me? Sign the final consent without pressing a single button. But I'm tired. For real. Grindstone burned away everything that was me. I hadn't spoken to a human in weeks. I forgot what my voice sounded like. I forgot what sunlight felt like. I was no longer a person. I was an interface. I went to the mirror. The only one I hadn't managed to tape over in the hallway. It was dusty, but it reflected me, tired, pale, with eyes that no longer had light. And suddenly she appeared, slowly. First, the outline behind her back. Then, her face. No eyes, with a gaping maw. I didn't turn around. I looked in the mirror. She leaned closer to me. I could feel her breath. It smelled of earth, mold, and something sharp and acidic. I didn't move. I accepted it. At that moment, Grinstone came to life. The screen turned on by itself. The camera activated. Recording began. I saw the red indicator blinking. I knew I was going to the end. Task updated. Share. Payment piece. She extended her hand in the reflection. I saw her fingers touch my shoulder, although I felt nothing physically. Only cold. Issy to the bone. I went to my laptop, opened my email, created a new letter. No subject. No text. Attached a link. That one. The link to Grinstone. I looked at the recipient field for a long time. Then I entered a random address. Sent. At that very second, in the mirror, she disappeared. The phone screen went dark. The recording has stopped. I found it hard to breathe. My head started ringing. I sat down on the floor and dropped my head onto my knees. My body refused to move. And suddenly, absolute silence. Not just the absence of sound, but the absence of the sensation of noise itself. It's as if the whole world has been paused. I fell asleep, for the first time in a long time without nightmares. When I woke up, it was already morning. The sun's rays were shining through the curtains. The world was normal. The phone was lying on the floor, switched off, no signs of life. I didn't pick it up. I got out of the house. I went out into the street. People were walking by, laughing, drinking coffee, living. The world returned to its speed. I felt light in my chest, as if the stone that had been crushing me for so many days had finally disappeared. I thought it was all over. And then, in the evening, I received a letter from my address. To my address. Subject, Grinstone. Message, you didn't think she was gone forever, did you? She's inside now, just sleeping. Click if you miss me. Under the letter is that same button, black, white inscription. One phrase, get started. I turned off the computer. I didn't press it. Bye. Story 8. My mornings began as usual with me waking up in silence. The house was empty, just me and Harley, my faithful dog, who always greeted me after a long night with a friendly look and a joyful wagging tail. I lived in a secluded house on the edge of the forest, away from people, away from the bustle of the city. It was my place, where I could be alone and focus on what was important to me. I loved silence and solitude, but with each passing day it seemed to me that these things that once brought peace were becoming less and less. When I came downstairs, Harley was already sitting in her place near the door, waiting for me to open it. She was a good dog, loyal, smart, and obedient. Every now and then I noticed that she was getting restless, especially at night. She would start barking, making noise as if someone was nearby, but at these moments, as always, I simply calmed her down. I thought it was just her instincts, a tendency to protect her territory. But I couldn't help but notice that sometimes she began to act strangely, as if something was bothering her in this house. I decided to take a morning walk around the neighborhood, to walk Harley and get some fresh air. The forest was as silent as usual, but today something felt different. There was a special chill in the air, even though it was spring. My footsteps and Harley's were the only sounds that broke the silence, but every now and then I heard something else. Light, almost imperceptible rustlings that could only be caused by the wind or movement in the leaves. But these sounds were not familiar. They were strange, as if someone else was moving next to us. hiding in the shadows of the trees. We got home and I felt a sense of unease creeping up on me. I wasn't a superstitious person, but sometimes something about this house made me feel uneasy. Everything was fine, but it felt like something was hiding. Something was just out of sight. Harley, as usual, kept an eye on me, but today her gaze was especially intense. Her eyes were filled with that strange worry I'd never noticed before. After dinner, I decided to do something that usually helped me relax. I read. It was a way to get my mind off everything else and focus on something specific. I picked up a book and settled into a chair by the fireplace. But I soon found that I couldn't concentrate. All my thoughts were occupied with one thing, what was happening around me. Harley started barking again. It wasn't a normal bark, it was something more disturbed. She was in front of me, her eyes glued to the door. At first, I didn't pay attention, thinking she had just heard something. But she continued without stopping. I stood up and went to the door, trying to figure out what could have caused such interest. I saw nothing, no tracks, no movement, everything was as it should be. I opened the door and looked out into the yard, but saw nothing. Only trees covered in a light spring mist. I went back inside and tried to calm Harley down, but the strange feeling wouldn't leave me. In the evening, as the sun sank below the horizon, the shadows in the house grew thicker. I could hear Harley barking at the other end of the house in the hallway. She wouldn't calm down, as if something or someone was trying to coax her out. I stood up, determined to find out what was going on. My footsteps echoed in the empty house as I walked toward her. The door to the hallway was ajar, and I saw Harley standing by the window, her head raised as if watching something. I walked up to her, but she ignored me. Her eyes were full of fear, a strange, indescribable fear. I tried to look out the window, but I couldn't see anything. It was just a dark space with no signs of movement or light. I went back to my room, deciding that I would not find peace that evening. I turned off the light and went to bed. Harley lay down next to me, but even at night she could not calm down. The barking continued. It was muffled, but very persistent. That night was the first time I felt real anxiety. Not physical anxiety, but anxiety that permeated every cell of my body. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that I needed to rest more and not worry about the little things. But something was missing, something important. Harley knew it, and so did I. I couldn't sleep that night. The anxiety wouldn't leave me, and every rustle in the house, every movement outside the window made my heart beat faster. Harley remained wary, her eyes glittering in the darkness, and I felt her tension rubbing off on me. It was as if she knew something I didn't understand. When morning came, I tried to get my day back into order. I went for a walk like I always did, but the forest was different today. It wasn't as calm as usual. Every tree seemed darker and the air was heavy and sticky. It wasn't just the cold, it was something deeper, something you feel in the back of your mind, like something is watching you, lurking in the shadows. Harley walked next to me, but her movements were more careful. She didn't run like she used to, but walked slowly, as if afraid to take an extra step. I tried to ignore my feelings, but eventually, when we got home again, I realized that something was going on. And it wasn't just my nervous musings. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. The night was coming on, and with each passing hour there was more and more of a feeling that something was wrong. That evening I noticed Harley acting strange again. She was standing by the window again, her body tense and her gaze focused on the darkness. The barking continued, but it was subdued now, as if she were trying to say something I couldn't understand. I opened the door and stepped into the dark hallway, trying to see what had caught her attention, but at that moment I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Harley's gaze was fixed on an empty section of the yard, as if she was seeing something I couldn't see. I stood still, but nothing happened. The wind that usually blew through the forest was silent today. Only silence and darkness surrounded us. I tried to calm myself, thinking that maybe I was just very tired, but when I returned to the room I realized that the silence had become deafening, as if it had swallowed up all the sound in the house. I tried to sleep again, but instead, in the dark room, strange images began to appear to me. They were not real, but it seemed to me that I saw something sliding around the corners. I stood up again and walked around the house, trying to figure out what was going on. Everything was fine, but there was an uneasiness inside me that wouldn't go away. As I walked through the hallway, I noticed that the door to the basement was slightly ajar. I never used the basement. It was a place reserved for storing old things, but not for everyday use. I remembered how long ago I had locked it with a key and hadn't even thought that there could be anything unusual there. But now, in this house, in this silence, every little change seemed significant. The night was especially long. I couldn't close my eyes, afraid that when I opened them, something would be wrong. The walls of the house seemed heavier, and the silence that usually gave me a sense of privacy was now oppressive. I tried to figure out what exactly was going on. Everything was calm around me, but everything in this house was unsettling. Even Harley, who was usually calm and confident, now seemed wary and tense. The next morning I went for a walk with her in the forest again. I thought that the fresh air and silence of nature would help me come to my senses. But even here in the forest, I felt like someone was following me. Every tree, every bush seemed to be hiding something behind its leaves. I didn't know what this feeling was, but it didn't let go of me. Harley walked next to me, but her steps became more and more cautious, as if she also felt that someone was watching her. We returned home earlier than usual, and I noticed again that the house was not as it had been before. It seemed that even the windows were looking at me with some kind of condemnation. I decided to go check the basement again. Although logic told me that it would be stupid, still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something important was hidden there. When I approached the basement door, everything was as usual. But something in the air was different, as if the house itself was trying to keep me from taking the next step. Still, I pushed the door and descended into the darkness. Inside, it was as quiet as before, but now there was something more frightening in this silence. I noticed that the basement floor was covered in a layer of dust, as if no one had been down here for a long time. But as I approached one of the corners, I felt something slide over my leg. I jumped up, almost falling, and started looking for the source of this feeling. It was dark, and I couldn't make out what it was, but soon I noticed something flashing in the corner under one of the old cabinets. Coming closer, I looked closer, and what I saw made me gasp. There was a small box covered in dust with a small lock. I had never seen it before. My heart started beating faster. I felt the cold hand of fear squeeze my throat. The box itself was simple, but its presence was unnatural. Something about it said that it should not be here, that it should not stay in this house. I opened the box, even though I knew by then that I might be making a big mistake. Inside were old photographs. Not just photographs, but strange images. They were of people I didn't know, and there was something unsettling about their expressions. Their faces were blank, as if they were emotionless, but there was a strange intensity in their eyes. Some of the photographs were damaged, as if someone had tried to destroy them, but they were still there. One of them showed a group of people standing in a circle, and in the background was a picture of what appeared to be my house, but this photo seemed to have been taken many years ago. How? Why? It was all beginning to seem unbearably strange. I decided to go upstairs with the box, but as soon as I reached the top step, the door to the basement slammed shut, as if someone had abruptly closed it from the other side. I stopped, feeling the pressure in my chest increase with each step. I quickly ran to the exit, but the feeling that someone was watching me did not go away. When I opened the door and went outside, I noticed that the forest looked different again. Not so peaceful, not so familiar. Harley was sitting on the porch, her gaze fixed on the direction I had just been. She didn't move, even as I approached her. I felt her gaze piercing me to the very depths. It was as if she was waiting for something I couldn't quite place. I stood next to her, looking around, and felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The forest I knew now seemed foreign and hostile. I didn't know what was happening, but I felt like nothing would ever be the same. At that moment, I knew I couldn't just leave. The house, these woods, Harley, all of it was connected to something dark that had been here before me, and maybe something had been watching me since I arrived. As I approached the door, I felt an unknown fear grip me. I didn't know what it was that scared me, the door itself or what might be inside. I slowly pushed it open. The click of the old lock echoed throughout the house, as if awakening something that shouldn't have been awakened. I stepped into the dark hallway that led to the basement and felt the cold creep into my bones. It was dark and quiet down there, but something in the air was strange, as if something invisible was watching me. I stood there, listening to my heartbeat, But just as I was about to go down, a strange sound was heard, light, almost imperceptible, but so loud in the silence that I froze. It was a footstep, a sound I had never heard before, footsteps that couldn't be mine. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I quickly closed the basement door, locking it in a way I hadn't done in a long time. I stood there, trying to catch my breath, but my entire chest was tight with fear. No matter how much I tried to explain what was happening to myself, I couldn't. There was something in that house at that moment that couldn't be explained. I looked around again, and my eyes met Harley's. She was sitting by the window again, and her gaze was more insistent. I walked up to her, and she, as if sensing my presence, turned her head, but there was something in her eyes that I couldn't understand. She knew something, but what? Who or what could be in that house? As night fell again, I was left with that question. Everything was so quiet I could hear my own breathing, but it didn't bring relief. I didn't know what would happen next.